Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I just wanted to let you know that we are about to begin the conference, so thank you all for joining us today. It's great to see everybody in the Institute. My name is Victoria Jubb. I am the Policy Assistant to Ambassador Satterfield. I just wanted to let you know that he is engaged in some shuttle diplomacy this morning, so he'll be here shortly, but I just wanted to let you know we'll begin in a few minutes. So thank you all, and look forward to a great conference.
Good morning. I'm Ambassador Satterfield, the director of the Baker Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you this morning, braving the rain, which does indeed come eventually to this town, albeit for a short period indeed. And to welcome Paul Salem from the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C., and his distinguished colleagues, including many former colleagues of my own, Ambassador Bob Jordan, Saudi Arabia, late Baker Botts, and very much a Texan, as well as our other distinguished participants. The Middle East is, of course, as you can read in any of the media, a, quote, troubled region. That term could have been used at any point in the past century, indeed, past century and a half or two. Crises of governance, democratization, basic human freedoms, liberties, approaches towards the world, approaches within the region to each other. There is more trade between any Middle East country and anywhere else in the world than there is between countries in the Middle East. The issue of hydrocarbons, pricing, the relationship between key countries in the Middle East, UAE, Saudi Arabia, others, and the Ukraine crisis, relations with Russia and Putin. Where is it going? Where are they going? And why, more importantly? What does the future hold for the region? All of these questions are significant, but more significant still is the reason why we're here today, which is not an academic discussion of the Middle East. There is plenty of that. It's what does this mean for the United States, for U.S. interests, for the interests of the global community of which we are a part? How should we better understand these events in this troubled region in order to be able to more effectively, more productively, more successfully manage our own interests, our own relations in a strategic fashion going forward? There are many, many different parts of this puzzle. Some are not intrinsic to the classic Middle East itself. They're external to the region. Ukraine, Russia, China, all are actors, all are actions taking place outside the region, but with profound impact on the region. The region, in turn, has impact on all of them. China is an active suitor. Russia has long been desirous of either returning to influence or enhancing its influence throughout the Middle East. How's that going? What's the best strategy, the best approach for the United States? And then comes the vexed question of Iran, which has loomed over the region for almost a half century now, in terms of its behaviors, in terms of the concern over potential acquisition of nuclear weapons, what to do about Iran. This will be a subject of a further discussion we will be having here as we follow at the Institute the extraordinary events taking place inside of Iran and what they may mean for cohesiveness of policy within the country and projection of malign influence outside. This is very much a work, a study, an event in process. But I leave you with one key thought which should shape all of the discussions today. The United States can only at its peril and in an act of extraordinary hubris and folly attempt to, quote, pivot, close quote, away from the Middle East. We can no more pivot away, although that has been quixotically attempted many times over many administrations in the past, and not for non-understandable reasons. It can no more do that than it can pivot away from any other area of the world where actions profoundly affect U.S. national interests. The Middle East, like most of the world, has a habit when one turns one's back of coming up and profoundly and immediately reminding again of its importance, usually in less than desirable ways. So, I welcome you all again. I hope this will be a productive, interesting conversation which directs itself always back to how best to understand what is happening and likely to happen, and what are the best courses drawing upon such understanding for the United States as we look forward. And I guess a passing remark that has to be made, lacking a crystal ball and having failed dramatically on several previous occasions to predict, I have no clue as to what the outcome of today's election in Israel will be. None whatsoever. So with that, have a great conference.
Thank you, Ambassador Satterfield. I'm Paul Salem, President of the Middle East Institute. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here at the Baker Institute. I've visited a few times before. We wish Secretary Baker well. He was slated to make a few opening remarks, but we wish him a good and speedy recovery. It's great to be here, to see a lot of faces that we've known before and others that we're meeting for the first time, to come with a number of colleagues and scholars from the Middle East Institute, to reconnect with scholars both from the Baker Institute and other centers, both in Washington and in the U.S. The topic of these couple of panels, I think Ambassador Satterfield rather masterfully sort of took us on an overview of the many aspects of these complex relations. I would also say that, if you look at both sides of the equation, U.S.-Middle East relations, the U.S. itself has been going through periods of unpredictable change. Next week we have midterm elections, which people in the region are watching closely. The White House has sort of pivoted, as it were, from one mood to another, which has confused both partners and adversaries in the region as to where does the U.S. stand in its foreign policy, how much domestic support does it have for it, what is the sustainability and steadiness of U.S. interests, U.S. policy engagement in the Middle East itself. So a lot is being watched about the U.S. The Middle East itself, as the ambassador said, is always in a period of considerable flux. We're about a century into the modern Middle East and the states of the Middle East that are still evolving in different ways. But I think it's important to note that there is no Middle East in one sense of the term. The Middle East is really a diverse range of countries, diverse range of economies. Hard to look at the UAE and compare it with Yemen, or look at Yemen, compare it to the situation in Turkey. It's really sort of fractured into many, many different types of states, types of economies, types of governance structures, and it makes the challenge maybe all the more important. The U.S.-Middle East relationships are also evolving within a greatly changing and a global order which is greatly under challenge. We see the tremendous stress in the European order. We see the rumblings of potential change in Asia and the Pacific region, and the U.S., China, Russia, Europe trying to figure out where the Middle East fits into this complex equation. I would argue that despite attempts, as the ambassador said, to pivot away, the last three presidents have sort of attempted to want to walk away from the Middle East, but the U.S. has enduring interests. Some are sort of a positive nature, and some are of a risk and negative nature. As we've seen in the last energy crisis, energy matters. One doesn't have to say that in Houston, but one can say that. The future of energy over the next 3 or 4 decades is going to continue to be an important facet of the U.S. Gulf relationship in particular, both for hydrocarbons as well as the energy transition. Trade, we saw what happened when the Suez Canal was blocked for a couple of weeks. Much of global trade goes through this part of the world. We see that security risk, whether it's spread of weapons of mass destruction or counterterrorism, all of which remain very, very acute risks for the U.S. and for the global order, remain very dangerous and hot issues in the Middle East. As well, we have the return of great power competition, that before the resurgence of Russia and the rise of China, maybe leaving the U.S. would not accrue as a benefit to a major adversary, but that is no longer the case. And similar a little bit to the Cold War period, simply remaining engaged in the Middle East is important also to keep China at bay, to keep Russia at bay, and sort of the global competition that's emerging. Finally, I want to say that we often, when Middle East panels look at what's going on today, analyze what happened in the last 10 and 20 years. But I would say that the U.S. and the Middle East need each other, will need to cooperate for much of the 21st century. This is going to have to do with energy transition, climate change, food security, security in general, counterterrorism, containing Iran, and all of that, but also on a range of issues. So as this relationship is set to be one that is long-term, we should also look at how we can build things sort of stronger, what can be built into a more sustainable framework for the next couple of decades in this complex U.S.-Middle East relationship. So it's great to see you all. We'll move straight into our first panel, led by my colleague, Mr. Brian Katulis. Brian is the Vice President of Policy at the Middle East Institute. Brian, over to you.
I don't know if I was just applauding for myself or for Paul there, but good morning. It's really a thrill to be here in Houston to work with the Baker Institute on this conference, and I hope it's the first of many collaborations because I'm really happy to see the mix of experts that we have here today and the conversation that we're going to have. Before I introduce the panel, I'm going to extend an invitation to all of you, because my boss, Paul Salem, didn't, to come visit us in the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. We have a wonderful facility just south of DuPont if you've not been there, and it's a new MEI, a new facility. We've been around for about 76 years, if you can believe it, and fulfilling our educational mission, which is to increase the knowledge of the Middle East with the citizens of the United States and to deepen understandings between the peoples of the region and the people here in the United States. And this is an important mission. I've been with MEI for about a year. I joined last year after spending some time in government, but then a lot of time in other think tanks. And I have to say that the Institute fulfills this educational role in many different ways. First, we have the Arabic and Persian and Turkish language. Hebrew as well is taught there. We have a cultural institute. So just a couple of weeks ago, we had a comedy show with comedians from the region. So it's fun, it's lively, but I would add as a point of entry, it's serious too. We do serious policy analysis. I'm the head of the policy center where we have 12.5 programs, which is the brainchild of that diabolical genius at the end of the table there, which range from a program on Egypt or on Iran, you'll hear from Alex Vatanka later today, or functional programs, like we have a climate change and water program, and our teams will be in COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. So we're linked to the region. It's a great place. It's a lot of fun. Sign up for our podcast. The latest episode is on Biden's national security strategy, and analysis that's not just us, but scholars from around different universities in the country. And again, we want to deepen those connections with places like the Baker Institute. Our panel this morning is titled, Why the Middle East Continues to Matter to America and the World. I want our discussion today to even question that premise, if some of the analysts think so. I think the introductory remarks by Ambassador Satterfield and Paul indicate that it does, but if people in the room are skeptical of it, what we want is a discourse about this. And we have an excellent panel, and I'll introduce them in some of the goals and some questions here, but what we're going to do is have a conversation for about 25, 30 minutes. I'll ask a few more questions, and then we'll open it up to your questions so we can make it a broader conversation. First speaker will be Gregor Gause, a professor at Texas A&M. He drove down last night, a couple of hours on the road. Second will be Dalia Dasake, who came in from LA. She's a senior political scientist at UCLA's Burkle Center for International Relations. And last but not least will be Jim Crane, who has home field advantage here at the Baker Institute. And then batting cleanup, I'm a baseball fan, a Phillies fan at that too, will be my...
I'm a Phillies fan too.
Yeah, I'm not the only one.
We're both from the Philadelphia area.
And I feel really bad about how all of you in Houston will be feeling tonight.
I have my hat in the car. I was going to bring it in, but then it rained.
But Paul will bat cleanup, and we'll have it as a conversation. Our goals are three here, just to outline them. One, what role the Middle East plays today in geopolitics? How has that changed? So we want to start with the global, situate the Middle East within this changing context. We've heard a lot from both the Trump and Biden administration about global competition and strategic competition with China and Russia. So situate that, and I want all of us to think about the current period that we're in, because I think we still haven't strategically described how the region has evolved while the world is changing, right? I'm of the view that the U.S. had an approach to the Middle East that was really set in 1979, and many of you lived your careers for 40 years in a particular period of time. And now the region itself is in a different moment, and the world is as well. And I think we're all grappling with trying to understand that. So that's one goal. Two is to offer a strategic snapshot of the broader region. That's not easy to do. For sure, we're going to get into certain files like Israel or Palestine or Iran. But what we're going to try to do in this conversation is keep it at that strategic regional level. And then lastly, as was mentioned, we're going to explore America's approach to the region, how it's evolving, how it's changing. We've heard the word pivot. I've used the word toggle, if you've toggled on your computer. Administrations have to do multitasking at the same time, and how do you integrate this? So that's our game plan. And let me just start out with asking Greg a question, because for the last 3 weeks, 4 weeks or so, at least in Washington, I'm sure here in Houston as well, a lot of the discussion about the Middle East has been focused on the OPEC Plus decision on October 5th, and what some have characterized as, the fist bump turned into a gut punch, and a very sort of polarized discussion. Take us, though, to that sort of strategic level, using the OPEC Plus decision and U.S.-Saudi relations, which you studied very carefully for decades. Help us understand sort of this moment, not only in U.S.-Saudi relations, but then how the United States is trying to relate to this changing region of the world.
Sure. Thanks, Brian. Thanks to the Baker Institute. Howdy. No Aggies out there? Thank you. I mean, I guess you urban sophisticates down here at Houston have gone away from our Texas traditions. But that's the official greeting at Texas A&M, so howdy. Look, in a very telegraphic way, I think that, as you implied, Brian, two things have changed. One is the world has changed, right? I think that we can classify American engagement in the region in three periods. The Cold War period, when it was very clear who our enemies were, it was very clear what our goals were, and it was pretty clear who was with us and who was against us. And that, occasionally that changed. You get Egypt onto our side, it's a great victory for us, right? Then we entered this period of American unipolarity, which was really ushered in, not so much by the collapse of the Berlin Wall, but by the Gulf War. And that kind of emphasized the dominant outside power role that the United States was going to play. I wouldn't call it hegemony for scholarly reasons, but we were told by Ambassador Satterfield to stay away from academic discussion, so we won't get into that. But happy to talk about that over the coffee break. But American unipolarity was a period where we were unchallenged in the region, and everyone in the region, with the important exceptions, but almost everyone in the region basically had to follow our lead. There wasn't any choice. We're now in a period of, I don't know if you want to call it global multipolarity, but it's certainly not American dominance of the region, and it's a period, I think, of great uncertainty and confusion, right? Is Russia a great power? Well, it looked like it until Ukraine, maybe not. What is Russia's role in the region in the wake of the bloody nose it received in Ukraine, no matter how that turns out? What do the Chinese want to do in the Middle East? We know what they want from the Middle East, but what do they want to do in the Middle East? I'm not sure they know. And of course, there's the United States, which we fluctuate between saying we're going to leave and then redoubling our commitments. Right? Paul very wisely pointed out that we've had three presidents, right? Our last three presidents all campaigned on pivoting away from the Middle East, right? The Obama administration ended by sending troops back into Iraq and committing to regime change in Libya. The Trump administration, right, adopted a policy of maximum pressure on Iran, which was completely inconsistent with a pivot away from the region. And the Biden administration came in and said, we're going to hold Saudi Arabia at more than arm's length, and then within a year basically had to try to re-engage with the Saudis, not particularly successfully. So the whole idea that we're leaving the Middle East, both Brian and Dahlia have written very interesting pieces on this recently, it's a fiction and we should just not even talk about it. I also wrote something about that, but it was in 2019 before COVID, and everything that happened before COVID is just a blur. So, read their stuff. So that we don't know what the global balance of power situation really is and how it's going to affect the region. And that's why the locals, I think, are keeping their options open.
Yeah.
Right? A country like Saudi Arabia, right, in the past looked to the United States for security, right? And during the Cold War, it couldn't go to the Soviet Union, for ideological reasons and the fact that the Soviets were backing Saudi Arabia's enemies in the region. During the period of American unipolarity, the Saudis had to be with us, even if they disagreed with us. The Iraq War, right? They very publicly disagreed with us and advised us not to do it, but they were with us because they really didn't see themselves having a choice. Well, right now, when American interlocutors go to Riyadh and say, look, China's a real problem, the Saudis say, not for us. China's our biggest customer and is not a threat to us. And they say, you got to be with us against the Russians. And the Saudis say, well, we need to have a decent relationship with the Russians because the only way we can manage the world oil market to our advantage is if we have some cooperation with Russia. And Russia's not a threat to us. Right? So there's no common threat to bring us together, whether that threat was communism in the past or Salafi jihadism during the period of American unipolarity. That's done. Right? So the automatic kind of siding of the Saudis with us for our big geopolitical projects, Arab-Israeli kind of set aside, but our big geopolitical projects, the Cold War, the war on terrorism, the Saudis were with us. That's not going to happen, certainly not going to happen automatically. The other thing I think that's changed about the region is that it's broken.
Yeah.
Right? The region is broken. The most important thing to understand geopolitically about the region now is that there are numerous political vacuums. Whereas before we had states, fierce states, authoritarian states, not states you maybe want to live in, but states that were building kind of state capacity around the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, right? If you think about the 50s and 60s, it was a time of military coups and overthrows of governments and all. But once you start in the 70s, sure, there's the Iranian Revolution, a real revolution. But those military coups and constant changes of government, they were limited to Lebanon, right? Which doesn't count, right? And other marginal places like even Yemen, about the most marginal place one can imagine, was ruled by Ali Abdullah Saleh from 1978 until 2011, for heaven's sakes. But what we see now is a bunch of political vacuums. Iraq, Syria, Yemen, the Palestinian territories, Lebanon, Libya, into which outside powers, they don't have to fight their way in. They're invited in by the locals who are fighting for their lives, who are fighting for their futures, right? And that's how Iran has developed this very impressive geopolitical position. It has a strategy for being able to intervene in these places because it has loyal allies who want to be part of the Iranian project, whether it's Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, the various militias in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the quasi-legitimate government in Damascus has become just yet another Iranian-supported militia. Mm-hmm. The Saudis don't have a counter for that, right? The people who are theoretically closest to them ideologically hate the Saudis and want to kill them. Right? And the Saudis under the Crown Prince have been moving away ideologically from the Salafi, from the dominant Salafi interpretation of Islam that was the state religion and still is the state religion in Saudi Arabia. So I think what we're seeing is a broken region in which the Turks, right, bet on the Muslim Brotherhood to intervene in these places and lost. They lost that in Egypt, they lost that in Syria, they lost that in Tunisia, they lost that in Libya, right? The Iranians have their loyal clients, the Saudis have no clients, and we, the United States, are very, very bad at dealing with non-state actors. We don't have a template for dealing with non-state actors. And in that sense, we don't have an entree into these places. And so I think we really have to be realistic about what the U.S. can do. We have to prioritize our interests. And here I have a very, very narrow set of priorities. Energy, counterterrorism and counterproliferation. My colleagues to my right and left have very, very interesting articles, and they talk about them in a few minutes, in which I think they put forward agendas for the U.S. and the Middle East that are far too ambitious, both for what we're willing to commit to the region and what we can accomplish. I think that we have to deal with people who have addresses. We're pretty good at dealing with states. We have the instruments to deal with states, to bring states around to what we would like them to do, and to punish them if they don't. And that means Iran. I'm 100% in favor of dealing directly with the Iranians, right? It means Saudi Arabia, no matter how distasteful you find the Crown Prince. It means Egypt, no matter how bad a person Sisi is. It means Israel, no matter how bad a person Bibi Netanyahu is. And it means Turkey, no matter how difficult Recep Tayyip Erdogan is. These people have addresses, and we can do business with them. We have the tools. We don't have the tools to deal with Hezbollah and the Houthis. We don't. We don't have the tools to deal with the Iranian-sponsored militias. Or at least we have the tools, but we don't have the commitment to use them. Understandable, right? Given what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, our military tools are not particularly, they could be effective, but at what cost, right? So can we, the United States, help restore order in the region? And I think order is the big issue regionally. Can we help build broken states? Well, we're a lot better at destroying states than we are at building them. And we don't have a good template for how to do that. But what I do know is that the project will take decades and strategic patience and the willingness to deal with people who are distasteful.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. That's a great point of entree. And three things I'd highlight is, one, you talked about the complex multipolarity in the world. Second, the state fragility in key parts of the region and how that actually, and you mentioned this in your foreign affairs piece, that's the source of a lot of the instability. And then third, you highlighted what I've called every single U.S. president's Michael Corleone moment, which is just when I thought it was out, I'm pulled back in. And we've had this in every
Godfather
single...
Part 3, a lot of people haven't seen it. But
and you also highlighted, and you mentioned this, the differences of views. You know, we've read each other's work and things like this. And I want to highlight, this is something we try to do at the Middle East Institute, is bring people with a diversity of views at a time when America's polarized, the region is polarized. Having a discourse, having a dialogue, not on Twitter, but in person and with folks, is so essential for all of us understanding our knowledge. Dalia, he mentioned, and I read a bunch of your recent articles, and it's really great. She's a prolific writer and thinker. And there's a common thread, there are several common threads, but one is you use the phrase the post-America Middle East, that the Middle East itself has moved into this phase. Yet at the same time, you know, you do, like I've written, offer a quite robust engagement for the United States in the Middle East. But here's the key thing as I read it. Non-military, that a lot of the U.S. engagement over the last 20, 30 years, especially since the CENTCOM, has been military-centric, and especially after 9/11. Maybe walk us through sort of any agreements or disagreements you have with the picture that Greg painted, and then let's delve into the role of the United States in the Middle East and what you think it should be in this next phase.
Okay, well, thanks, Brian, and thanks to the Middle East Institute and Baker Institute for hosting this. I was telling my colleagues that if there was this much rain in LA, there wouldn't be a single person in the room. So thank you all for coming. Originally I was tasked with kind of giving the headlines of what the strategic picture looks like, and I still want to do that because it gets to a lot. Actually, it's the area of agreement I have with Greg, so maybe I should start with agreement before I dig into disagreement, but I do have to just have a couple of responses. And I'm so much respect for Greg's work, but I think we do have to keep in mind that the way we've been doing business for the past 40 years or so has not been particularly stable. And the idea that the region is now broken we have to ask ourselves, wasn't it already broken? Would we have had Arab uprisings in 2010 to 2011? Would we have what we're seeing in Iran today if the region was working? I'm not saying it's all because of us. I think actually we give ourselves too much credit. A lot of what happens in the region has nothing to do with us, and we honestly have to be, I think, much more humble about what we can influence and not influence in this region. But I also want to caution against straw man arguments about the notion that we need to stay engaged in this region, which means we have to rebuild countries. Greg and I were in agreement opposing the Iraq War. I think we shouldn't have just torn apart governments. But we're not talking about agenda of rebuilding regions or not dealing with states. States themselves want to deal with issues that go beyond energy or the old oil security bargains of the past that frankly aren't working anymore. They are dealing with climate impacts that are leading to vast transitions in their own countries, probably catastrophic events coming their way. Youth unemployment, health issues. These are not issues we're making up. These are issues countries in the region, addresses, leaders, those very brutal authoritarian leaders themselves are dealing with. And we could work with them. I agree, we should work with those leaders on those issues. So I'm not suggesting this broad agenda for its own sake, but I think we just have to adapt. We have to be smart, we have to be realistic, we need to adapt, and we need to be thinking forward and out of the status quo policies that have really led to a lot of, in my view, getting to U.S. policy, a lot of inertia. But I do want to just give the three headlines where we do agree, because I think it's important to your tasking, Brian, of what you wanted to accomplish here, which is what is the nature of the world today and how is the Middle East fitting in? And I think, I'll give three obvious headlines, but add a little bit different aspects than Greg talked about. This post-American Middle East is real, right? The big headline of the day is we're not the only game in town anymore. There is a decline of U.S. predominance where, Jim Baker, his name's everywhere here. We are not in the days of Secretary of State James Baker, who was a remarkable Secretary of State, but we are not in the 1990s. This is not the first Gulf War where we can get the world behind us, where we can convene a major international conference with the Soviets and then the Russians and bring everybody in the region, the world to the table. It's just not that world anymore. It's not that region anymore. There's a lot of fatigue with this region in the United States. This is across the political spectrum. These were costly wars, with Americans seeing very little payoff from the wars in Yemen, Libya, Syria, and of course Iraq. Tremendous U.S. treasure and blood spent on those wars, and then of course Afghanistan, which I don't call the Middle East, and we're not sure what we got. So there is a real fatigue, and let's face it, the region themselves, when you go to the region, our partners across the region themselves are saying, you guys are out the door, right? We're not making this up that we're just leaving the Middle East, we're pivoting to Asia. They say, you don't seem to have the same interest in us anymore. And they're kind of right, we don't. But for all the reasons that were laid out, we still find ourselves pulled back in. And I think what we need to do is get a little bit smarter about how we respond to that. And we need to keep in mind that a post-American Middle East is not a Middle East without America. And the reality is, and sometimes I ran for many years, and we do a lot on data and numbers, and just look at the numbers. We have tens of thousands of U.S. forces still in the region. I know a lot of our partners say, well, that doesn't matter because you're not using them, right? You're not protecting us. But, they're there for, they're not just there, kind of sitting around. We have the collapse of the JCPOA. It's unlikely we're going to see, in fact, we have not seen a dramatic reduction in our force presence in this region. That is notable. And to the extent that there are changes, we have to understand that post 9/11 was an anomaly. We had over 50% of U.S. forces in the world based in the Middle East for 20 years. That was not normal. Compare that to 2% of our global force presence in the 1970s, about 6% even after the 1991 Gulf War and Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, after we drew down after the initial invasion and response. Okay, so we didn't have a normal situation and engagement. So we need to normalize, which means reducing our military commitments, focusing on these other issues, and getting smarter about the military commitments we do maintain. So that's headline number one, post-American Middle East, but not a Middle East without America. Headline number two, of course, is the rise of China. I mean, there's just no way, we're at the point of no return. And it is true, we're a little bit unsure about what China's aims are, but we're not that unsure. They have this thing called the Belt and Road Initiative. The Chinese are pretty strategic, and they haven't been shy about what this is about. They need the region, first of all, for energy, of which they import about half of their oil needs from this region. And this is an integral part of their global growth strategy. They're now the region's #1 foreign investor. They're the #1 trade partner to the region. You have hundreds of thousands of Chinese nationals based in countries like the UAE. They have significant attachment to this region, mostly economic. Of course, there are fears that this is going to morph to the security and strategic arenas, given the fact that some of this economic infrastructure development has been in very strategic targets like ports, like 5G technology that the United States worries and others worry could be used for surveillance purposes, and it could put our forces, in fact, that are in the region still in large numbers in harm's way. So, there are worries, but let's be, again, realistic and distinguish between perception and fact. Yes, rise of China, for sure. Military investments, no match for the United States. You cannot compare what China is doing militarily to the enormous security architecture the United States continues to maintain in this region. Certainly the drone sales and missile sales are a major area of concern. The U.S. still exports over 50% of arms to the Middle East. China under 5%. Okay, so yes, the drones are bad news. They happen to mostly going, by the way, not to Iran, but to the closest U.S. partners, Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So, it's the bottom line is this is a complex picture, but there's no question China is on the rise. We're going to have to grapple with that. Like everything else, we need to be smart about how we do it. And finally, the last headline, and this is another area I agree with Greg, it's all about hedging now. We're not in the era of ideological blocks anymore, if we ever were. It wasn't that clear cut even in the Cold War, but now we really are not in this. We don't have communism, we don't have Islamism even. At this point, it's all about nationalism, power, resources, right? We're going to work with the parties we need to. We, America, don't want to take your side on the Ukraine war. This is what you hear from the region. This is not our war, right? This is not our problem. We're not going to cut ties with China. This is our #1 trade partner. We need to be realistic about these new realities. There's a real gap in perception and understanding, and we're not going back. We are going to see hedging continue from this region. They do not want to take sides, whether it's with US, China, Russia. They want to play all sides. And that's the new normal we're going to have to adapt to. And it's the new normal that's going to get us into these spats like we just had with the Saudis, because it was not just about oil. It's about, we see the world differently. And I'm just going to end by thinking about this, because we said, okay, how important is the Middle East anymore?
Yeah.
Well, I'm a big believer it's still important, and we all make our careers on Middle East, so we think it's important. But let's be realistic. No global power today, be it the US, Russia, or China, puts the Middle East as their top region of priority. It's second to third at best for all global powers. So let's think about that when we think about how we're competing globally. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Dahlia. And your 3 points, that it's a post-America region, but America's not leaving. China's rising, but there's limits to it. And that there's this new era of strategic hedging that we'll see in the region. I think those are some fundamentals at that strategic level we can try to thread through the conversation. Jim, I want to drill down on this issue, on what you focus on energy. And maybe we'll talk a little bit later in the conversation about the U.S. role on economics, commercial ties, energy ties. I'm old enough to remember, and it was just a few years ago, where people were saying, well, America's producing so much, the Middle East doesn't matter as much these days. My guess is one of the reasons why Biden went to Saudi Arabia this summer was because Russia invaded Ukraine and oil prices shot up, and they realized a lot was going on. You recently wrote a brief with your colleagues Mark and Christian, and we'll hear from Christian later on the Iran panel, about the nature of the Saudi-Russia relationship in the context of OPEC+. And I know we talked about it a little bit with Greg, but maybe situate this moment that we're in right now. Consider the moment we're in here in America, which is high inflation, the thing that's driving, I think, our election debates in about a week, and people are focused on it. Europe is looking at what many people consider to be a very tough winter ahead. But also, just in a few weeks, we have another attempt to sort of discuss the international climate issues in Sharm el-Sheikh, which will be followed by COP28 in Abu Dhabi next year. So it's a very complicated moment in the much ballyhooed sort of energy transition, which will probably take some time. Situate the Middle East and this recent episode within this sort of context for America right now.
All right, well, I'll try. Thanks, and welcome, everybody. So yeah, I'll try to go through some of this through the kind of the energy and climate lens, and maybe to try to get to some of those questions through a few different routes. So first of all, let's just think about that cut that OPEC Plus made on the 5th of October. All right, a shot across the bow, as it were. I think there's a couple of things that I'd like to talk about around the cut. So this is, I think, as we heard, part of that is we've got new leadership in Saudi Arabia, and this is something that's we're not used to seeing from Saudi Arabia. Pre 2015, with when King Abdullah was in power. In fact, a brilliant new book just came out from a former advisor in the Saudi oil ministry named Ibrahim al-Muhanna. And it's basically a blueprint of how different Saudi oil market strategy is now than it was under previous ministers and kings. So that's part of it. Saudi really used to be the bulwark of against the price hawks within OPEC, kind of halted OPEC and prevented them from making these kind of behaviors. So the trigger for the cut was probably, as we all know, this mutual disadmiration between President Biden and Mohammed bin Salman. But really, there's at least a decade or more of prior grievances on both sides, right? We heard about a few of them. This idea that from the Saudi side, from the Gulf side, that U.S. support has been fickle. That we've been too nice to the Houthis. Biden administration retracted the terror designation. We haven't been providing sufficient air defense support. This pivot, of course, as part of it, the Arab Spring. We find ourselves on opposing sides in the Arab Spring in a few different places. And from the U.S. side, lots of grievances as well, right? So. This issue of increasing state repression that we're seeing, the numbers kind of climbing up in a lot of the Gulf states. The Khashoggi murder, of course, was particularly egregious. What's going on in Yemen is, we view that from a totally different view, right? These depredations in that increasingly brutal war, or until recently, very increasingly brutal. We kind of view that as a problem of their own making, the Saudi and the UAE's own making. So providing air defense against Houthi missiles is sort of trying to get them out of their own mess. And then if you haven't noticed, Russia is now in OPEC, right? And they're one of the two top guys in OPEC calling the shots. So of course, Saudi interests and OPEC's interests are shifting. And by the way, why is Russia in OPEC? Well, that was brought to you by U.S. shale, right? So U.S. shale, one of the downsides is that, we wound up cranking up oil production here, stealing about almost 5 million barrels a day of OPEC's market share, and without any basically free riding on OPEC's cuts, right? So every time OPEC would cut, shale would respond with it, ramping up production. So the only way that the OPEC guys could respond to that was by bringing Russia on board. So the cut. The sort of preemptive cut, even described as a preemptive cut, even with inventories at 2014, haven't been this low since 2014, a cut right before the election. Really, I think it's a warning to America, to U.S. presidents, that we shouldn't take the Saudis for granted anymore. I think it's exposed the fiction that the U.S. president has anything to do with oil prices, right, or with U.S. gasoline prices. This is something that people blame on the president. The presidents love to take credit for when they go down. No, I think it's Saudi is looking like a pro-Republican interventionist in U.S. Politics. But I think that's just because the Biden administration's probably been more hostile than recent Republican administrations. But if a Republican administration were to do the same thing, we'd probably see a similar move. I do think it's a bit of a rash move. We've got oil's monopoly on transportation. So oil has, in oil-producing countries, that basically enjoyed a lock, on the internal combustion engine, the jet turbine. That's it. These are all oil. All of our transportation is oil-fueled. That is starting to change right now around the margins. We're seeing different fuels. We're seeing electric vehicles, new technologies. So, this monopoly, this 100% monopoly on oil, on transportation, is winding down. So if you're an oil producer, probably a smarter move on your behalf might be to promote oil's longevity, not try to promote EVs by making oil more expensive and showing the geopolitical risk. If you want to avoid high prices and risk exposure, you buy an EV now, right? And then the more EVs that people drive, the less market power, the less power that Saudi Arabia is going to have on your life, and writ large on what the U.S. president has to do to stay in office. And really, it's lots of other vehicles use oil, but it's the personal vehicle, I think, in U.S. politics that's important here, because that's what the voters are driving. So if the voters are insulated from Saudi behavior, then the U.S. president has more leeway. So the Saudis might counter this argument by saying that the oil market is shifting towards the non-OECD countries, right? The less developed countries, and that the OECD is already a market in decline, which is true, right? But that's where their hard security protection comes from, and that's where is from the non-OECD countries and from us especially. Are they going to get the same kind of friendship that comes with security from other customers? I guess we'll see, right? They might. They're still going to be in the oil market for a long time. Oil's still going to be with us for a long time. They're going to have a big share of that because their costs of production are so low. Now, Saudi Arabia, interestingly, made this net zero pledge by 2060. Many of you probably heard about this. Interesting. That's something I've been writing about a lot lately. First, some questions about their credibility. I mean, they've made a lot of pledges on big energy projects in the past that haven't come to fruition. But if they are serious, they've got great rationale for doing this. They are under a lot of climate pressure. That region is really struggling with really long, deep heat waves, and that if the power goes out, those heat waves are going to be really, really deadly. Lots of potential damage. So they've got major advantages in decarbonization. They've got, and that even selling carbon services to other countries. So if they do choose to take it seriously and go down that route, I think they can influence the energy transition. Right now we've got the energy transition sort of, the leading technologies we're seeing are wind and solar, sort of the European decarbonization model. I think the Saudis would like to push that to a more Saudi-friendly direction, hydrogen, carbon capture and storage. But that would kind of keep alive that the fossil fuel, that energy delivery model.
Great. Thanks, Jim. And that's a great summary of sort of the complicated energy picture we're in right now. Last but not least, my colleague Paul. Paul, I wanted to ask you, when you hear what everybody has said on the panel, and when I'm looking at the clock here, I'm going to ask just a couple of questions. So for those of you who want to ask questions, you'll have an opportunity in about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll leave it open for about 15, 20, run over a little bit later because we did. Paul, you and I have talked about these countervailing trends within the region itself. There's, on the one hand, escalatory moments, as we saw with Israel and Gaza in August. Inside of Iraq, there was really a frightful moment inside of their politics. There's certain moments of escalation with Iran, but at the same time, there's a broader de-escalation and in some ways regionalization, integration, normalization trend as well. So even as there are tensions with Iran on some points, there are conferences and engagements between the Saudis and Iran on other points. That era from 6-7 years ago, when there was a split within the Gulf and Qatar was isolated, that is more or less over, but still papered over maybe. Turkey and its relations are quite different. So there are these countervailing dynamics that within the region themselves is pretty complicated. Maybe you could tell us how you see this. And then incidentally, if you want to respond to Greg and his charge against Lebanon not mattering, I should highlight that just a couple of weeks ago, why, if you're not on our email list, you're missing out. We had Amos Hochstein, who was the key diplomat who actually helped execute this deal between Lebanon and Israel, signed on the eve of their elections, Israel's elections today, so not a small task. And that's where the role that we play, as we hear from current officials and things like this. So on the region, and then maybe if you want to intervene and take on Greg on Lebanon.
Thanks, Brian.
Sure.
And I'm aware that we definitely want to get to a conversation with the audience. We've taken up a lot of their time. But a couple of things. I mean, when we're talking about the Middle East, we sort of end up talking about the Gulf a lot. And I want to, in a moment, say a few things about some of the other regions that are facing, obviously, very serious problems and challenges. But when we look at the countervailing forces that relate to the Gulf, the obvious two are the Abraham Accords and the recent sort of light dialogues with the Iranians. I think the Abraham Accords maybe have at least two driving forces. One is Iran, to try to find a counterbalance to Iran and a local backer, a local supporter. It relates to the perception that everybody on the panel has indicated that there is no longer a sense that the U.S. is there and able and willing to protect the Gulf countries from attack. Saudi Arabia was attacked, UAE was attacked, Gulf shipping was attacked, and both under Democratic and Republican administrations, really there was no serious response. So sort of the Carter Doctrine doesn't seem to apply anymore from their perspective. So part of it was to look for a local supporter. Israel obviously would be a major one. Secondly, and I think this has been hinted at as well, maybe by Greg and others, that when you look at the UAE or Saudi Arabia, they're thinking of their growth, their development, their interests getting ahead. And when they look at Israel, they see an advanced economy, technology, win-wins on all kinds of sectors. And I'm putting aside the Iran question for now. And it became sort of a no-brainer that obviously this is a great economy to hook up with. And that was one of the drivers of the Abraham Accords for some of the countries, certainly the UAE in particular. On the sort of light dialogues with Iran, I think it also reflects the conclusion in the Gulf that the U.S. is not going to deal with Iran, cannot deal with Iran, cannot protect them from Iran. They're going to have to live with Iran. And their option is to try to de-escalate lightly while trying to build as many defenses and as much deterrence as they can. I think it's a rational policy. I think they've quickly discovered that it really doesn't mean much. Iran is not willing to negotiate really about anything meaningful, neither in Yemen nor Syria nor Lebanon nor Iraq nor Bahrain, actually. So I don't think that's a trend that is going anywhere other than it's better to be talking than not talking. It maybe de-escalates a bit. But when I pull back and look at the broader region, where we are today in 2022, and as you know, we've hosted a number of events with the World Bank, with the IMF, with the UNDP. When you look at countries like Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Jordan, let alone the semi-failed states like Lebanon or fully failed states like Yemen and so on, but even the functioning ones like Morocco and Egypt and Tunis and Jordan. In 2022 and 2023, the amount of debt they've accumulated, the strain of dealing with COVID, the strain of losing tourism and a slowdown in the global economy, the continued demographic pressures and the need for services and government outlays, and enormous debt burdens at a time when global interest rates make it basically very difficult, extremely difficult to borrow. I worry about the many other shoes that might yet drop. A number of countries are at the breaking point, and I've listed a number of them. Lebanon already broke. Lebanon, in a sense, that's true, doesn't matter in any sort of broader sense, but I do fear refugee flows from Lebanon and Syria, refugee flows potentially from a more broken Egypt or more broken Tunisia and Morocco. What that means to me for U.S. policy, and I wouldn't, disagree, and I don't disagree with sort of the various ways that it's been put. First of all, there's no black and white answer. The Middle East is not the most important region for anybody, and that's absolutely true. And yet the U.S. has enduring interests for many, many reasons. The point is how to right-size that engagement. Obviously, it doesn't want 50% of U.S. troops in the region, doesn't need them. They maybe did more harm than good. It's more about right-sizing, smart engagement, doing things that are cost-effective. Preemptive action is very important. I don't worry about Saudi Arabia and the UAE. They'll take care of themselves. I don't worry about Israel. It'll take care of them. I worry about Morocco, about Tunisia, about Egypt, about the countries that haven't completely broken down and where preemptive action is still useful. That's why I greatly valued U.S. and Saudi and other sort of cooperation on food security, which is tremendously important. It's no small matter that Morocco is the biggest producer of fertilizer in the world. We should take that much more seriously. It's as important as oil in today and tomorrow's world. Debt relief and managing these enormous debt burdens is in our interest. Better to manage it now than manage a failed state, which we cannot manage after it's failed already. So when I look at the region, I see a lot of forces at play, and a lot of them are worrisome. I would say at the same time, something, when you look at the region, at the globe and the region, the Middle East, many of the states that are functioning, and especially the more successful ones like the UAE and Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and to some degree Turkey, some degree Iran, the balance of power has shifted to more of a balance, that these are no longer, tiny, economies, weak states where a Soviet or an American or a Chinese could come and dictate anything. These are states and economies that are coming into their own. They know how powerful they are. They know how much influence they are. They control their own territories, those that are successful. So I don't see that the region is going to fall from one sway to another, under another sway, but rather be its own set of actors. What worries me most is something Greg mentioned, is that this region is not a region. It has no regional order. It's a region still at war with itself. To what degree can regional leaders make progress? The Abraham Accords are a big breakthrough. To what degree can the U.S., in its diplomatic capacity, and let's make no mistake, that U.S. diplomacy is still more effective than Russian and Chinese and so on. We have more friends in the region. The Amos Hochstein deal is a good example of what, some low-cost, high-intensity diplomacy can achieve. And I would urge that we use our diplomacy, lean forward as much as we can with diplomacy and have a win here and a win there. And I also, as I said in my opening remarks, the relationship between the U.S. and the Middle East is going to be there for the next century. So let's not, it's not we're going to leave, we're going to come. How do we figure out the various tracks on economics, business, security, climate, water, food? This is a rich and long relationship. We haven't even mentioned sort of the cultural and religious aspect, the Abrahamic religions, all interact with what happens in the region there. So I will stop there.
Great. I want to leave at least 10 or 15 minutes. We're going to run until about 10 till, so we don't lose our caffeine break. But I do want to ask one very brief question, and for brief responses, though it's a hard question. And you've all alluded to this. But if after next week's election in the United States, Jake Sullivan and John Feiner at the National Security Council call you all in and say, fly you into Washington, and say, we really are concerned about our standing in the Middle East right now and what we're doing, what would be the one thing that you would say should be the priority for U.S. policy? What would you say that they would do? Greg, you've alluded to it in terms of stability, and there needs to be stability and work with those partners. Don't have an ambitious list. Dahlia, you've alluded to a number of things about diversifying our approach and also maybe right-sizing our military approach. Jim, do we have a national energy strategy as a country? Does it link up at all with the region? Paul, you've alluded to, but very precise. And then what I'll do, I think there's a microphone in the audience. If not, we'll figure out how we'll moderate questions. But if you have, okay, there we go. We have note cards. This is how we do it here at the Baker Institute. If you have questions, start writing them on note cards. And I guess we have somebody who will go around. What's your name? Anna will go around and collect them, and then we'll try to squeeze them all in before the coffee break. So there you go. Who wants to go first on what the U.S. should do, especially in the next few years? It could be directed to Biden, but then more expansively that we haven't been doing in the region.
Mine is just very simple and direct. I mean, I think that the next big crisis is going to be the collapse of JCPOA, and as Iran moves toward the ability to weaponize, I think that that's going to lead to all sorts of pressures, both regional and domestic, for the U.S. to do something. We should be thinking about what that something is going to be, and we should be consulting with people in the region so there can be a united front on that.
That's great. And we sort of almost intentionally tried to avoid the Iran issue because the next panel will do it, and we don't want to step on their toes. But it is obviously a key elephant in the room, not just the JCPOA, but then with what the people are doing in the streets of Iran and trying to protest against their leadership. Dahlia?
Yeah, I think we need to leverage our platforming role better, and Europe hasn't been mentioned here, but with other like-minded allies around the world. And I would be focusing on reduction of, we need to get serious about arms control in the region again, and de-escalation. We need a platform for de-escalation for the very reason Greg said. We are headed into a very dangerous few years. The shadow war between Israel and Iran is not so shadow anymore. It's going to be much more overt with the collapse of the JCPOA is gone pretty much. And now we have direct U.S. Iranian engagement in Syria and Iraq and other places. So we need the light Iran engagement you talked about with the Gulf. Mm-hmm. We need to beef that up. And we need to work with international partners, work with regional partners. We need a serious de-escalation platform. We need somewhere where adversaries in this region can talk.
Yeah, so that's key, and I hope the next panel will talk about it. I saw Secretary Blinken last week at a forum, and this administration has avoided public discussion of what a plan B on Iran looks like, I think for fear that they think it puts it into a military space, whereas what I hear from the region is they want a modus vivendi and a different sort of way of thinking about it, and I think that's hopefully for the next panel to tackle. Jim?
Yeah, for me on the energy side, I mean, for us here in the U.S. and for importing countries, I mean, diversifying your transportation options, your transportation technology, reducing your risk exposure to the region means, driving more efficient vehicles, and, you have government policies that promote more efficient vehicles or vehicles that don't use oil, which would have a benefit in freeing up your foreign policy. For the region, what we could do, I mean, helping them through the energy transition. I mean, we have a lot of expertise, especially right here in Houston. I mean, we're in the same boat as the oil-producing states of the Middle East, and that boat has started to move. Houston's trying to become the energy transition capital of the world now, not just the energy capital, and that means the same types of technologies that they're interested in the Middle East. So leveraging hydrogen and carbon capture, using your geology, that's underneath our feet as a storage mechanism, which, by the way, uses the exact same companies and expertise and infrastructure that oil and gas does. So it's actually like expanding the oil and gas sector and bolting on a waste disposal, a business on that. So, and then since we're mentioning Iran real quick here, if there were a way to bring down the level of conflict between the U.S. and Iran, a bit, it's an interesting source of potential spare capacity, something we talked about here recently. If the Saudis are not playing ball on spare capacity, we have the sanctions on Iran that can, if we wanted to, we could selectively enforce them and allow more oil production to reach the market if need be. So, interesting option.
Yeah, my comment would be one, maybe to warn against that type of thinking, like what's the one thing that we could do that would kind of fix things. We've tried that before on two counts. One is the U.S. has so many tools in its toolkit, it should use them all. Diplomacy, higher education, culture, security, defense, counterterrorism, energy, and that's America's advantage. It has 13 different things it can do. And the more we think of our engagement in that multipolar kind of sense, the better it is. Secondly, I think we have to think of it in terms of conflict and risk management, opportunity pursuit, rather than, this area has a problem, what is it that we can do that can fix it? The Iran problem, to my mind, has no fix, really. You manage it, you deter, you contain, sort of like the Soviet Union. Unless the revolutionaries in Iran, do something inside Iran, there's not much we can do. The one thing I will reiterate, we're heading into a winter and a year where energy prices are weaponized, food is weaponized, countries are already on the brink of collapse in some of the countries I've mentioned. We see how the U.S. is sort of trying to move heaven and earth to get gas to Europe and to save Europe. We see some effort with some of these big countries that are on the southern border of Europe that could have a great impact on Western security. We saw how Russia and Turkey used Syrian refugees to sink part of Europe a few years ago. That might be in the offing as well. So I would say look at the things that might happen that we could still preempt and prevent.
We have some really interesting and excellent questions in about 10 minutes. I'm going to try to eeny, meeny, miny, mo, so I don't expose any biases here, and I sort of ordered them. And maybe we'll have one or two responses to it. We'll do it sort of like a Quaker meeting here to see who's inspired. This is interesting, and I think we kind of didn't see 2011 coming, meaning the Arab uprisings and everything that came, at least the scale of what happened. What are we missing today? What's the black swan? Some of you alluded to some of these things that are outside of our field of vision. I think it's a very interesting question. Who wants to take it? Paul.
Well, first of all, 2011, yes, wasn't predicted, but if you read a lot of the sort of human development reports from the decade before, it was all laid out there. Deficits in governance, demography problems, unemployment, repressive regimes. Of course, the timing wasn't predictable, as revolutions often are. The impact of the social media and of satellite television wasn't predicted. Those same pressures are much worse today than they were in 2011. The demographic, economic repression has gotten worse in a number of countries. What is a bit different is that there isn't as much hope in revolution as there was back in 2011. Revolution was seen as, we'll just get rid of the dictator and things will be fine. In the countries where dictators have been removed or challenged, things got much worse. Libya, Syria, Yemen, and so on. So I think there's less appetite. But as I'm indicating, it's not a black swan. It's there. It's the protests are happening. You see it today in Iran. Same pressures, but maybe more hopeful revolutionary spirit than you see in the Arab countries. And that's what I'm warning against. That it might not be protests so much as collapse and inability to cope.
Great. Maybe this will be a jump ball, less of a Quaker-style meeting between Dahlia and Greg. Is order more important than supporting open, pluralistic societies? I think we know where you stand on this.
Yes.
And
No.
You cannot have
Put your dukes up.
You cannot have the hope someday of a more open and pluralistic society unless you have order.
So, Dahlia, do the counter, but then the second part. Can we stop propping up autocratic regimes against operating with impunity against their own populations? And if so, how? And
Look,
Greg says no.
I don't think, I'm going to go with Paul on this. It's not door number one or door number two. It's not either or. I mean, we're going to have to work with bad guys. I'm in favor of engaging, or at least before these uprisings. Now it's a different story. We'll have to see what becomes the Islamic Republic. That is the biggest black swan question of the day. But no, we need to deal with bad guys. But it can't be that's all we do, and we have no other requirements. We neglect the societal level, which is what we've been doing for a very long time in this region. Because you will not have order without functioning governance, without functioning societies. And you can do it in small Gulf states with very small populations and mostly expats, working, basically your government is functioning. But you can't do it in the countries that Paul is talking about. There's a reason we had the Arab uprisings to begin with. We're going to have them again. The story is not over. We're going to have more disorder than we could even imagine with the coming climate disasters that are ahead of us, if we don't get functioning governance. And that doesn't mean perfect democracies, but you need more accountable leaders. And right now we have very unaccountable leaders in this region.
I have no argument with that. What should the United States do? Because I think that our list of tools in this regard is very limited. It's not 13, it's not 3, right? When the United States goes to these places that actually have functioning governance, but not good governance, right? We can have a laundry list of things, but after number 2, they stop listening. And if we put, you have to have free elections, number 1, or you have to treat your people better, you have to empty your jails of your political prisoners, which would all be great things. If we put that at number 1, we're not going to get to number 2, because they're going to say, you're looking to change my regime. I think that from a practical point of view, the only way that we can think about these kinds of long-term changes is by fostering an order that encourages economic development. That's something that I think has to come from the bottom up. It's got to come from American companies wanting to do business. I mean, my big problem, when you look at like the Davos in the desert in Riyadh, is that all those American investment banks and all those American companies are there, 87% of them, and I just made that number up, 87%
You're
of
not
them.
at Rand.
Right, yeah. Not at Rand, I can make up numbers. 87% of them are looking to take money out of Saudi Arabia, not put money into Saudi Arabia. Right?
So,
and here's my black swan, which Paul actually mentioned before. The change in interest rates. Debt has been so cheap for decades, and now it's not. And Egypt is facing all sorts of immediate repayment problems in 2023 that I don't know if the Saudis and the Emiratis are going to bail them out.
I want to, Brian, make a point about sort of the democracy issue and so on. Well, first of all, I think the U.S., I agree with Greg on that issue. It's been shown and proven they have very little influence on rulers who are worried about much more serious things than the American ambassador being upset at them. That's going to be something the region's going to have to work out for itself. I'm not very optimistic. I'm worried about what's going on, but it's not really an American foreign policy thing in that sense. I do think, however, that the U.S. being the U.S. should continue to be the American democracy and represent itself and say the things and so leave it at that. But looking at it from the region, the biggest impact has been the stumbling or semi-failure of democracy in the United States. That the power of example has completely fallen in the last 7-8 years. That this is no way to run a country. Electing strange leaders and contested elections. Every 2 years you change. Whereas they look at China, not that they like China or love China or speak Chinese or are going to end up sending their kids there, but they see stable, steady government and so on. I think what's going to be impactful in the next decade is whither goes U.S. democracy. It was a beacon for a lot of people for a very long time. I think what's happened in Russia has really, people thought Putin was, a wise, brilliant strategist, great dictator, ran his country well. Trump said it, he was a tough guy and he knows what he's doing. Turned out to, a mistake as big as the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And now people are looking to Xi to see, well, is he going to be the brilliant, masterful, growth-oriented Chinese leader, or in 3-4 years is he going to run aground somewhere else? So I don't think democracy and governance is a very complex issue in the region, and I would say a number of the monarchies are doing very well at governance. In other words, they manage well, their government capacity to deliver is much more than the U.S. government in terms of many things. The governments are accountable to the leader, to the CEO, and some CEOs are damn good in the Gulf.
Yeah.
They are not accountable to their people,
Yeah.
but our accountability system hasn't been doing great in producing results.
Yeah, it's an important point, maybe to the last question. But before, I've heard a lot on my recent travels to the region about this worry about America's strategic reliability. And this is, to be clear, not a partisan statement one way or the other. It's just a deep concern about the coherence of our own political system and the pendulum swings that often come from administrations, even if it's not in fact in policy, but in vibe and in tone. And it seems to some that Israel or Saudi Arabia is a red state, Iran's a blue state. And my view is this is a very bad thing for the United States, which is why we at MEI work with as many, when we go on delegations, we go with people who had served in Trump and Obama, Bush administrations, Clinton as well. This sort of transpartisan approach is essential, I think, in our field to try to break down these barriers. The sectarianism that I think was in the Middle East has somehow been translated back here in U.S. policy. Jim, question to you, and maybe we'll round out on this, because you mentioned 87, you made up that figure of 87% of those businesses.
Completely made up.
Who are at the Davos in the desert. There's a really interesting question here is what are the current trends in oil-funded development within the region? And I think by this means there's been $1.5 trillion windfall, I think, from the Gulf states just from this past year alone. And they're looking, as far as I could tell from the news, to deploy spending in their own countries, but then you see in Turkey and Egypt and Pakistan, and I see it as slightly different. Our colleague Karen Young, our mutual colleague, has written a lot about this, and others have. Where are they using these resources? And maybe linked to it, another question on U.S. engagement is, can the U.S. help the region invest in infrastructure in these regions in the way that China is doing? And again, we're just scratching the surface to what I think is an important part of U.S. possibilities for engagement in the 2020s that don't involve military or simply civil society or the false choice between stability and democracy, but one that actually is focused on a more abundance or a prosperity agenda for the region.
Yeah, it's not something I track that often or that much, but you are seeing, a lot of the money from, these massive profits in oil shifting into their, in sovereign wealth funds, investment funds within the country, being used to build lots of infrastructure, new financial zones, new cities, et cetera, in these countries for better or worse. And then, on the outside for, farming, food security, or buying assets that can provide a return back into the country. That I maybe leave it there.
Yeah. Good. Well, that's a good point. And let me close by saying that I think we've had a very rich discussion here. We're trying to move our collective thinking about the region from, I think, one phase to where things are going. And it's really cloudy, I think, across the region. And we're going to hear more on Iran in particular. But my hope is that we can move beyond this sort of mindset that this is just an arc of crisis, that America needs to react to crises and problems and try to work with partners in the region to figure out opportunities, to get ahead of things. And I don't see as much, even though there's some differences of opinion here on the panel, I think if you synthesize this, there is an interesting pathway forward if America has the attention span and the appetite to do this. So please join me in thanking the panel for what has been a rich discussion. And for those who didn't get their questions answered, corner them in the coffee break. We'll reconvene at 11.
It's probably like 99%.
talk a lot.
For the Saudis, speaking of Ukraine, the Saudis not the U.S. or couple in terms of what they are and want to live their extraordinary policies, not as the West. For the Saudis, much of this is not into social services, from which international business zero predictable actual outcomes, but no one can say no to and this is what I worry about. This the sum wasted tens if not hundreds of dollars in visions in the desert that the consequences of that certainly he is an outlier. Oh, there's no question. You have tendency pivoting back under pressure from the other Emirates and his own who are engaged in this expeditionary exposure, which has reputation, harm, things that matter to all of us, to know their game other than this vague sense of projecting your authority on myself. He's responded pragmatically to this. He did not.
He's playing both sides. He's playing both sides.
Yes, but my understanding is he was not supportive of the decisions that were taken. He wanted to use supervision. And he doesn't have it.
Oh, really? What's your last name again? Zarlinsky. Okay.
She was my czar.
Okay.
Got my text message. Yeah, I waited. I always told you to say hi all the time. I said, okay, just checking whatever like that. Anyway,
Great.
thank you for coming in.
My pleasure.
I appreciate the comments. You just be up there at 8 a.m.
Yeah.
That's part of Trump coming. I'm a Harris County, so I do believe in democracy. What the hell? I mean, how do you talk to these people? I mean, democracy is a state here. Fascism, not super fascism.
I don't disagree. I think the problem for many minorities is they bought into the idea that the Democrats are going to keep their lives. I just think they're done. Not just think they're done. Which is
It's nonsense. Of course, if you live in a bubble, you watch certain media. Crazy old guy, but it just seems like this is his
bigger problem that he's going to be talking about.
Yeah.
People in Saudi Arabia, texting we're talking about this is the thing that I remember getting
And people should know better. James Baker, our namesake You voted for Trump. For God's sake. I like his policy. What policies? Hate people? Yeah, why you start? It's a bit concerned. I don't know what to do. We have an election. I don't know well. Works out. Keep our fingers crossed. Doug Gals, right? Is it Doug Gals? No, Gregory. Gregory, yeah. John Holmes. Gregory, thank you very much.
Do we have somebody ringing the chimes to call folks back in?
Victoria was about to do that.
So what did Anna say? Is she going to?
If you start, then they're going to say.
Ladies and gentlemen, having caffeinated, we hope, yourselves for the next round, we would like to start in just one moment. If you would please take your seats. I'd like to thank again the previous panel for a quite extraordinary discussion. The points of views, the analysis presented are exactly the kind of focused, coherent, not always in agreement, but always well thought through presentations which the public debate here and elsewhere on these issues is all too often very sorely lacking. So thank you again. I'm going to moderate the discussion which is now going to take place on an issue which looms large over all of the factors discussed previously, which is Iran. For all the challenges faced by the Middle East, however one defines it, in terms of demographics, failures of governance, problems of human rights, all of those things which our panelists previously raised and commented upon, there is another shaping issue, which is the now 40-plus year phenomenon of an aggressive, assertive Iran, where I will indeed use the term hegemonistic in terms of describing Iranian ambitions. It is not coincidental that many of the developments which were referred to by the previous panel in terms of a certain greater regional coherency, cooperation at a security level, are motivated, in fact, by the phenomenon of the threat posed by Iran. It is not just the, I think, more than perceived questionable intention of a succession of U.S. administrations to be actively engaged in effective defense of regional partners. It is the active threat that Iran poses through the Houthis, in and through Syria, in and through Iraq, that challenge the region greatly. And the region is resorting to a number of means to deal with this. Self-help, the acquisition of means from the plethora of states, and not just Russia or China, India, most of Europe, parts of Latin America, all too eager to sell equipment, which may not be of the same quality of the best the U.S. offers, but good enough. The phenomenon of the drone, as it was used in the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, as it is being used now in Ukraine, not drones at hundreds of millions of dollars apiece, but drones for a few $100,000 apiece. No human pilots to risk, no great loss if the drone is shot down. This is a new wave of national security challenge to a U.S. national security industry, which has been platinum plated and solid gold inside. We make the best at the price of the best when many others are making good enough at a far more attractive price, far more readily available, and far more willing to sell. And that poses longer-term challenges, not just for U.S. executive branches, but also for the U.S. Congress, where if we are speaking about broken things, the process of tiered review of military sales in the U.S. Congress is, and has for approaching a decade now, been almost wholly broken. And that is a challenge which every administration of whatever party takes up, bitterly complains about, and doesn't really deal with in a coherent and a sustainable fashion. I will make one further remark because I can, which is a response to one of the questions posed at the end from the audience at the last panel about what is it the U.S. could do more effectively. And you heard a variety of answers, but I will offer one from my own experience. Articulate credibly, frankly, to the American people in the voice of the most senior members of the administration, that means the president, and on down, what the challenges are to U.S. national interests, what those interests themselves are, how the world, not just the Middle East, poses challenges which present a circle that is not and never could be completely squared, where pragmatic but principled policy, I take that phrase from Jim Baker, has to be the watchword, the fundament of the U.S. approach to international challenges, but where pragmatism and principle often compete. There is no perfect answer, but to walk away or to pretend that there is a black or a white and either-or solution has not and will not yield successes for us or mitigation of risk. And you know, at the end of the day, it's not a bad message to the American people not to talk about the perfect, but how to avoid a deterioration of the good into the bad. It is not a perfect world. We strive for one, but it isn't there. But we certainly can act more effectively to mitigate the generators of harm to the U.S. and to our allies. And frankness, honesty in presenting that, whether it's energy policy, in explaining why prices at the pump are high or low, explaining really what the impact is of decisions by producers overseas, not just the Saudis, do or don't matter in the grand scheme of things. That's necessary, and it is all too lacking. There's huge debate over whether or not the decision taken by the president to withdraw from Afghanistan was correct or not. The truth in lending, I happen to believe that it was. But it was something that Joe Biden had believed in strongly since 2009, when he and President Obama conducted the months-long strategic review of policy. And when President Biden spoke from the East Room all those evenings, he spoke from the heart. His message may or may not have been convincing, but it was one of the most honest, frank, brutally frank presentations I've heard a U.S. president make on foreign policy issues. But that same kind of frankness is very much needed, big and small, in dealing with the challenges posed by Russia, by China, by the conflict in Ukraine, by the Middle East, by challenges here in this hemisphere. And if it isn't done in this fashion, the demagogues, the populists, those who would instrumentalize discontent, unhappiness, fear, ignorance, will have the field to themselves, and that will not augur well for the future of the United States. So we now begin a discussion of Iran, which poses to us, which poses to our regional partners, significant challenges. How do you assess what's going on in Iran right now, this phenomenon of protest? What does it mean? What doesn't it mean? Where is Iran going? What is the impact on the region, beyond the region, on Europe of Iran, and what should the United States do? With that, I will turn the discussion to Mohammed Tabar. Mohammed?
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you all for coming. Let me start by saying that the events of the past few weeks reveal some fundamental tensions, or rather contradictions, between the state and society in Iran. And of course, not all of this is entirely new. Starting a few years ago, various independent and state-sponsored surveys and research projects signaled that the Iranian society, especially the women, had been moving away from the state's religious ideology and becoming more and more secular. So the population was becoming more secular, and even the pious minority, which has been the traditional base of the regime, was becoming more and more divided. In fact, a big portion of this base was resentful of the state ideology and its regulation of its religious practices. So it wanted to be more and more independent. So recognizing these developments, the Islamic Republic has been trying to downplay Islamism and its Islamist ideology and adopt a nationalist discourse, and basically portray itself as the provider of stability and order in the region. And saying that without the Islamic Republic, the entire country would collapse into chaos and Iran will become a second Syria. So this is what the regime has been warning, and using Syria as a case in point to demonstrate that this will be the people's fate. So the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA in 2018 and its maximum pressure policy against Iran in a way strengthened this narrative, especially as we saw how the Iranian public reacted to the U.S. assassination of the Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in January 2020. Hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps even millions, poured into the streets mourning his death. But the ongoing protests in Iran now show that this use of national security discourse by the regime has not been entirely successful. The protesters are chanting death to the Islamic Republic and see the regime itself as a threat to Iran's territorial integrity. And they want to erase the last 43 years since the 1979 revolution, and have shown remarkable resilience and tenacity nationwide, especially on university campuses, despite the brutality of the security forces that we see every day. So between the regime and the protesters, we have a silent majority now, many of whom sympathize with the protesters. They're resentful of the regime's brutality against the population, and yet they're fearful of a second Syria scenario. On the one hand, the protesters now, they've been continuing with the demonstrations, and the protests may not die anytime soon. And they continue posing a long-term threat challenge to the regime. But on the other hand, they have not offered a viable alternative in terms of what would replace the Islamic Republic. An alternative that could be appealing to the population, broadly speaking, and could bring them to the streets. So we don't see, so there are a lot of people out there for sure, all over the country in remote areas, not just in big cities. On the other hand, the number of the people that have come out is not comparable to what we saw during the Green Movement in 2009. And I think it's primarily because a lot of people are concerned about what could happen if the regime goes down. So that's where we are in terms of the protest, kind of a stalemate. I think that's what it seems to be emerging. Now let me very quickly, if I may, Ambassador, discuss what all of this means for the nuclear negotiations and then the JCPOA. On the one hand, the protests have distracted the regime, so it's been making it more difficult to focus. On the other hand, in terms of the policy that the regime has on the JCPOA, I don't think we're going to see much change. In a way, you would expect that in the middle of all these protests, the Iranian government would seek an agreement that would erase or ease some of the economic and social pressures that it's facing. But its policies so far suggest that the regime doesn't think that a nuclear agreement is beneficial and can help resolve the current conflict. And the reason is that the kind of public pressure in favor of a nuclear agreement that we saw in the past, something that helped former moderate President Hassan Rouhani negotiate a deal, something that led to the JCPOA in 2015, has disappeared, partly thanks to the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA in 2018. The protesters now have much more radical demands than just the revival of the JCPOA. They just want the regime to be gone. On the other hand, the U.S. has also announced recently that the nuclear negotiations are no longer its priority, given the ongoing protests and demonstrations in Iran. And all of this is actually working in favor of the regime because it can preserve its nuclear achievements, especially in the past couple of years, and at the same time blame the failure of the negotiations on the United States. So I don't see much impact, at least in the short term, from the protests on the JCPOA. So let me just end here, and then I'll be happy to discuss some of the questions.
Christian, we heard in the previous panel a discussion of changes, policy adjustments and shifts, primarily within the Gulf, because our focus tends to be on the Gulf states, the peninsula. Your thoughts on the impact of all of this?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the first panel, which I think set the scene really well for this second panel. I want to look at mainly the Arab Gulf states, the GCC states, and their responses not only to the JCPOA, or the lack of, but also to the current protest movement that we're seeing, and the carefully calibrated responses that we're seeing. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. There never has been in the Arab Gulf states. There's never been a Gulf-wide consensus on foreign policy, security, and defense policy writ large, still less vis-a-vis issues such as Iran or Iraq. Maybe to some extent on Yemen there has been. And we've seen that since 2019, since the attacks that were alluded to by Paul between May and September 2019, when we had attacks on energy and maritime facilities in Saudi Arabia, the UAE. We had Iran or Iranian-linked groups really responding to the maximum pressure campaign with a campaign of maximum resistance, of which Saudi Arabia and the UAE were on the front line. And the lack of an overt response by the Trump administration in September 2019 to the attacks on Saudi oil facilities, which for a time took out almost half of Saudi's oil production, was not only traumatic, but I think it changed the discussion in Riyadh and in Abu Dhabi and in other Gulf capitals at an instant. You know, the old notion that there would be a response, that US protection or somehow US would militarily respond if their interests were hit, was put on its head in the most cathartic way. And I think we see a lot of the hedging that was spoken about really developing as a result of that decision by President Trump to actually state specifically that this was an attack on Saudi Arabia, it wasn't an attack on the US. And actually what we did see was when US interests were hit, for example, when a US drone was shot down in June 2019, or the attack on a US military contractor in Iraq in end of December, which led to the tit-for-tat that culminated in the killing of Qasem Soleimani. When the US interests were hit, they hit back. When Saudi or Emirati interests were hit, they didn't. And I think all capitals in the Gulf looked at that and thought, well, we can't have everything riding on one relationship. We need to have strategic and other alternatives. And we see that today with Saudi and Russia. We see that with China's more forceful entry into the region, including into the strategic space. I think that's a lesson that at least the Saudis and Emiratis took from 2019. For the Qataris, actually, the lesson was in 2017, when we had the attempt to isolate Qatar in June 2017, and President Trump initially supported it on Twitter. And so for the Qataris, that was their moment of truth, their moment of thinking that the entire basis of our regional and international security and defense relationships may be up for reassessment. So in different ways and for very different reasons, we've had a kind of rethinking of some of these assessments that I think we are now seeing very strongly in regional responses. So, for example, with the JCPOA, with Iran, we've seen, and I think this previous panel alluded to these as well, we saw diplomatic tracks opening up. We saw the Saudis meeting with Iranian delegations on multiple occasions. I think there have been at least five rounds of talks. We've seen the UAE begin its own track. We've seen the Qataris, the Kuwaitis, and the Omanis continuing to do their own thing vis-a-vis Iran, all with the aim of de-escalating where they can to at least protect and preserve their own interests, knowing that they would be in the front line were there to be any escalation. But what we haven't seen is a Gulf-wide approach. We see the Saudis doing their own thing, the Emiratis doing their own thing, the Qataris and the Kuwaitis and the Omanis doing their own thing. So there's still no GCC-wide approach. What we're seeing instead are these individual leaderships putting their own interests first. And where those interests don't necessarily converge or align with the US interests or the interests of the West writ large, that's what they do. And I think we are seeing this, not necessarily divergence, but certainly a much more putting us first approach. Now, to some extent, we saw that in 2015 when the climax of the negotiations to generate the JCPOA also led to the Saudi-UAE decision to go into Yemen in March 2015, almost stating to the Obama administration that we don't believe you can isolate Iran's behavior in one file, the nuclear issue, and ignore everything else, Iran's support for regional proxy groups. Now, the one thing I think that is different today in 2022 is that we are seeing a much less adventurous Gulf. The appetite for confrontation or the appetite for regional assertiveness on the part of the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris is much less today than it was in 2015. You know, we're seeing a dialing down of these confrontational approaches towards each other, still less towards Iran. I think one of the reasons the Trump administration was so frustrated by the issue over Qatar in 2017 was that President Trump went to Riyadh and urged the Middle East, or at least the Arab partners in the Middle East, to unite against Iran. And within 2 weeks, they fell out with each other instead of actually kind of coming together against Tehran. So we're seeing these very strong kind of country-first approaches towards the JCPOA, towards what happens next. And I suspect that will continue. And actually, this is to some extent what Iran wants. Iran doesn't want to have to try and engage with a bloc of 6 countries resolutely siding with the US and other Western states. Iran is very happy, I think, to engage bilaterally with the Saudis, with the Emiratis, with the Qataris. It really kind of undermines the attempt to build a bloc against them. And then just on the protests, again, we've seen a very careful response, partly because I think leaders in the Gulf don't want to give the impression that protests can lead to any form of political instability or political change. After all, these are regimes that don't permit public protest at home. So we have seen a very careful, I think, approach to how the protest movements are being recorded. We've even seen some prominent Saudis try to make the argument that actually Mohammed bin Salman has already given women their rights in 2016 and 2017, and this is an example of preemptively pushing the envelope instead of waiting for women to try and seize their rights, as is happening in Iran, which I think is maybe a creative interpretation of a lot of history, but there we have it. Potentially, if the Iranian regime feels cornered, feels they begin to lash out, we could see, and Mohammed, I think, has talked about this to some extent in other forums, there's a London-based television station called Iran International, which has links to Saudi Arabia in terms of its funding. It seems to be performing a very similar role that Al Jazeera performed in 2011 in terms of really publicizing what's happening, making very visible images available to the entire region. And we've already seen some Iranian leaders, I think, speaking out against Iran International and by extension threatening Saudi Arabia with retaliation over the apparent linkages and support, even though they're based in London. So if things come to a head, we could see a lashing out, and we could see the Saudis being targeted. And then finally, I'll just end by saying, well, in 19 days from now, we have probably the biggest sporting event in the world beginning in the Gulf, in Qatar, the World Cup. And I would hope that the authorities in charge, both in the Qatari government and FIFA, have a contingency plan for what happens if Iran's games become the venues for large-scale protests, either with the thousands of Iranian supporters who will be in Doha, or because of the highly geopolitical nature of the games, Iran against the US, Iran against England. So the world is going to the Gulf for the next month at a time of extreme volatility. And I just would hope that there's some contingency plan for what happens if there's an overspill of protests and dissent into the streets.
Very good. Thank you, Christian. Suzanne, you've waited patiently on the screen from Brookings. I'd very much appreciate your thoughts, your comments on the variety of issues: internal dynamics in Iran, basic Iranian power projection politics, the so-called malign behaviors, their motivations, their likely future, as well as thoughts on the impact of all of this on not just the JCPOA as a framework, but Iranian ambitions and intents with respect to their nuclear program. And then I will ask Alec, you to play, in the words of the previous panel, the cleanup batter on all of this. But Suzanne, over to you.
Thanks so much, Ambassador Satterfield, and I do wish that I could have been with you all in Houston and at the Baker Institute. It's such a great institution and organization, and really such a terrific group of speakers that you have down there in person. I was listening in during your break, and even the sideline conversations were terrific. So I'm glad to be here and glad to have a chance to weigh in, especially after the presentations that just preceded me by Dr. Tabar and Dr. Ulrichsen, and very interesting point about the world going to the Gulf over the next month. It will be very interesting for all of us to watch. And of course, that's what we've all been doing over the course of the past now 5+ weeks, watching a series of events that were, I think, even as they began to unfold, almost unimaginable for those of us who've been paying attention to Iran for a long time. Obviously, Iran has been the scene of considerable unrest at different points over the course of the past 40+ years since the revolution unseated the monarchy and gave rise to the Islamic Republic. And so there's almost a degree, I think, of cynicism and skepticism that is inherent, especially among those of us who've been at this business for a long long time. This sense that we've seen it before, it doesn't tend to lead anywhere. And of course, for those of you who have a wider remit across the region, there is the bitter experience of the outcomes of what was once the hopeful uprisings in 2011 and the Arab Spring. I think it's incumbent upon all of us to try to shed some of that cynicism and to appreciate that what's happening in Iran today is truly unprecedented and truly meaningful, even if I think it's unlikely that it's going to lead to a very near-term change in the nature of the government or even the persons of the senior leadership. And so let me just give a moment or two to explain why I think this is so significant. As I said, there's been a lot of unrest over the years in Iran, but what we're seeing this time around is quite different than either the small-scale economic protests that have erupted, particularly over the course of the past 5 years, especially after the application of maximum pressure. These were primarily economic protests. They were primarily driven by those in the working class, and they were, precipitated by specific events: a rise in gasoline prices, change in the nature of the subsidy system, things like this, which brought people to the streets in fits of fury, frankly, against the regime, but without any coherent political program other than a denunciation of the system itself. These protests are different, as we've already heard, in the sense that the current round includes cities across the country. It includes very much a cross-ethnic and cross-class composition. We have not just the working class, not just the upper and middle classes who came out in 2009 in a very powerful way and marched and at that time had a very clear political program. It was to try and reinforce the credibility and the reliability of the Iranian electoral system, which is of course subsumed within the larger theocratic framework of the state, and at that time, as well as in many other episodes, was perverted in order to serve the purposes of sustaining the current regime in power, rather than to reflect an accurate representation of what had happened in highly stage managed polls. So this time around, what we have is both those who came to the streets in 2009 and those who've come to the streets over the course of the past 5 years. The tactics of both movements coming together, the kind of clear articulation of slogans and a demand on the part of the people who are coming to the streets. This time it is not, of course, about where is my vote. It is not about trying to reinforce the validity of the minimalist electoral aspect of the Iranian system. It is very much about a different system. It is a denunciation in the most vociferous terms of every element of the current regime and the current leadership. And I think that that's clear, and it has been sustained now for a longer period than any other episode of unrest in Iran has, certainly within the past 30 plus years. And that is extraordinary, and it suggests that the system itself is having difficulty in managing this challenge to its authority. In 2019, the government, within 2 days of protests breaking out over gasoline prices, had shut the internet entirely. And over the course of the next week, credible sources suggest that about 1,500 people were shot. It very quickly produced a quieting of the outward signs of dissent, even if obviously dissatisfaction remained. This time around, there has been, as we've all seen through the videos circulating on social media, incredible brutality, but there has been at least not yet the escalation into the significant numbers. We're hearing at this point, I think after 5 or 6 weeks, about 300 individuals killed, thousands arrested, thousands detained, thousands gone missing, thousands injured. But not the scale and scope of the very quick and fierce and frankly effective crackdown that happened in 2019. And I think that, there too, there is something to be said about these protests, which suggests that there is a distinction between what's happening now and what's happened in the past. That being the fact that it's not just simply protests. We have the civil disobedience element, the fact that women are now walking out on the streets unveiled, taking opportunities to demonstrate their defiance of what has been a core principle of the Islamic Republic since its founding. We've had some evidence, at least, of efforts to try to organize strikes among university students, which is hardly surprising, but even strikes that might impact some of the important aspects of the Islamic Republic's economy. There have been strikes of taxi drivers, of at least some efforts to organize petrochemical workers at the refinery at Hamadan. It's not clear if this has had a major economic impact to date, but I think so long as these protests remain, the capacity and proclivity for strikes will grow. There have been cyber attacks on various arms of the Iranian state, the state broadcasting authority, the central bank. And again, there too, I think that we see this is more than just a protest movement. I think it's also important to kind of understand why it's happening now. Which is that all pathways to political change within Iran, which 20, 30 years ago appeared to include the possibility at least of reform from within, have now been blunted. The fact is that there is no meaningful expectation of any change in a positive direction, either politically, socially, or economically from the current leadership. And even if, as we all expect, there is some process of succession, there is no expectation that someone better is waiting around the corner. And so I think that there is a fundamental delegitimization that has occurred of the Iranian leadership. There is a disaffection which runs deep and wide within the population. And it's not going to be abated by any efforts at either conciliation or crackdown. And so it's going to be a sustained and frankly corrosive undertaking of protests that are likely to erode the capacity of the security forces, the will of those who are going to be forced to make a decision on a day in, day out basis in cities around the country about whether or not to try to detain, arrest, or repress women who simply want to go about their lives without the state's control over their headgear. I think that we know from the past that these kinds of individual acts of civil disobedience can begin to sustain a structure, organization, coordination, and leadership. It won't happen quickly, and it won't happen in the near term. So let me just get to the questions that Ambassador Satterfield posed and that are fundamental to this panel. What happens to all those issues we care most about with respect to Iran's regional and foreign policy? I think that there's likely to be very little change. Obviously, the administration has said the JCPOA isn't on the agenda, but that's not because of an affirmative decision by the United States. That's a decision that is a reflection of the fact the Iranians have been unwilling to sign on the dotted line to terms that were negotiated months ago. There is a deal on the table. If and when the Iranians decide to take it, I suspect that the Biden administration will proceed along those lines, simply because they see no better options for managing the near-term challenge of Iran's nuclear industry. And because this is an administration that does not want another crisis in the Middle East. And if there is any way to kick the can on Iran's nuclear ambitions, they will find it and they will take up that opportunity. I think there will be very little change in terms of Iran's regional activities. If anything, this is a government that is determined to demonstrate that they have the upper hand. Even if their leverage and their degree of capacity appears to be under some threat, especially in Iraq and in Yemen as well. So I think that they will stay the course, but I do think that we should take into account some of the precedents of the past. In 2009, even as Iranians came to the street during the then Green movement, the Obama administration continued to pursue efforts to try to come to a nuclear accord with the Iranians, and in fact did, only a few months later, negotiate a confidence building measure around the Tehran research reactor, which was intended to be a stepping stone to a broader nuclear agreement with Iran at the time. It looked like a great accomplishment, a great achievement of diplomacy, even at a time of internal turmoil in Iran. But then it quickly collapsed because the Iranian leadership was so severely divided by the events happening within the country. And I think that's really a risk that we run now. If we're relying on diplomacy to try to manage the threat from Iran, I think it's quite questionable to assume that this is a leadership facing this kind of overwhelming challenge on the streets is going to be able to not just negotiate, not just sign off on, but in fact abide by any agreement with the international community. Final point, we haven't spoken about it in great depth in this discussion, but I think the provision of thousands of Iranian drones to the Russians, the only country in the world that is contributing to the Russian combat operations in Ukraine, is going to create a very different dynamic within at least the EU3 and the United States in terms of how to proceed with respect to Iran. With that, I will wrap up and then look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you, Suzanne. Alex, a lot to reflect upon, but I'd like to follow on Suzanne's presentation of the what next aspects of Suzanne's presentation.
Sure. Well, first, thank you very much for having us here. It's a pleasure to be with you. All the good things have already been said by my colleagues, but I'll try and sort of go back to what Suzanne said on what Iran is doing in Ukraine. When we read the news that the Islamic Republic was providing drones to Vladimir Putin in Ukraine, I think most of us Iran watchers, the conclusion we made was clearly the JCPOA, the nuclear issue, is secondary for him. That Khamenei has already made up his mind that if he has to choose between making Vladimir Putin happy or Joe Biden happy, he knows which one to go with. I think there's no doubt about it in my mind that he has, for some time, decided that the so-called look east policy of the Islamic Republic, which is basically, if I could summarize it, this idea that the West is declining, that the West, United States and Europe are declining powers. The future is not in the West. The future is China and to some extent Russia. That has been his philosophy, and we can get into how he got there. But I think that the decision right now, with the protests going on, with JCPOA hanging in the balance, to do what he did, combined with the leadership from the Revolutionary Guards, tells me that the nuclear talks are secondary. And it goes back to your point, Ambassador Satterfield. You know, what should the U.S. message be? The question to ask is, a U.S. message for who? If you're trying to articulate a clear message for Ali Khamenei, the Iranian supreme leader, I think the first thing you have to ask is, what are those values that are driving U.S. policy to formulate that U.S. policy? I think there is no agreement from what I can tell in the United States in terms of what actually shapes American foreign policy. We talk a lot about American values, but really when it comes to the sort of the footnotes or the small print, we're not sure. I can tell you the Iranian opposition is not sure. They don't know if they can bank on the United States. So, you know, the question of what is U.S. policy is something that we wrestle with. Brian and I are going to write a paper. I've spent the last 16 years being an Iran watcher. I can tell you what the trends look like in the Islamic Republic. I can tell you where society's going. But when it comes to the issue of what should be U.S. policy, that's where it becomes, particularly for someone like me, who is of Iranian heritage and has to potentially worry about the country ending up in a civil war. Right? So that's one of the key concerns, not just for me, for the Iranian opposition. Mohammed was talking about a lot of people being on the fence, and I think that is certainly something the United States can help with. It doesn't necessarily have to be part of a very clear message from the White House, but various U.S. policymaking communities can contribute, help the Iranian diaspora, which is basically the Iranian opposition, come up with ways to formulate a better agenda for themselves, which then the United States can support. That's not the case today, right? Before, when the Shah fell in 1978-79, you had a single leader, Ayatollah Khomeini. Everyone kind of went behind him, and we know what we ended up getting. But the fact is there was a force there. There was somebody that was mobilizing it. That's not the case today. But look, a couple of other things, Ambassador, before I turn to, because I really want to start the conversation and hear the questions, but a couple of key realities for U.S. policymakers are the sort of basic indicators of what's happening inside of Iran. This is a country where the youth, the so-called Generation Z, have given up on anything to do with the Islamic Republic. They're not just giving up on the Islamic Republic. The data shows that Iran is today the most secular country in the Middle East. right? This is the world's most modern theocracy, with a population that over the last 43 years had gradually moved away towards secularism, in many cases actually turned their backs on Islam entirely and leaving the religion, right? So that's just one indicator. I can go on and give you a long list of things that are going wrong. This is a country, for example, depression is going through the roof, suicide rates are high, people are not having families, they're not having children. I mean, the indicators speak for themselves, and you don't have to take my word for it. This is basically being debated in Iranian state-run TV pretty much every night. What's wrong with society? So they know what's wrong, but at the top of this pyramid, you got Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, who is more interested in one thing than anything else, and that's his succession. And he wants that succession to happen in a way that reflects well on him. There is speculation that he wants his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, to take over. Separate issue. I don't want to get into too much of that. But the point is, he does want to leave behind the legacy of the guy that brought the United States to a standstill, that he didn't cave in. He wants to be doing what Khomeini did before he died in 1989. This is Khamenei's, basically, I think, overall overriding interest. This is about him, the person, not Iranian national interest. If you're thinking of Iranian national interest, it absolutely makes no sense for him to send those drones to Ukraine, which we don't even know how much in terms of cash Iran receives for him. It was a symbolic gesture he made. He wanted to make a point to Vladimir Putin, who, by the way, he has known on a personal level since year 2000. Very few people out there know Khamenei as well as Putin does in terms of foreign leaders. So Khamenei has made up his mind. I think the succession issue is really the reason why we ended up with the protest in Iran. There was no need for the regime to go out there and enforce the mandatory veil the way they did the last year and a half, 2 years. The only reason they did that was to exercise power, to tell society that we're running the show here and you should not dare ask questions. Why? Because I think when Khamenei dies, he wants to make sure he has maximum space to do what he wants in the succession process. But I just end with this because, again, I want to make sure we have time for the debate. If you look at the so-called Generation Z, these are people born year 2000 and after. They're just becoming politically active now. This is a group of people, 70% of all those arrested in the last 5-6 weeks have been under the age of 20. This is a group of people that is just finding its political voice. And what is interesting and should shock Khamenei is that they have no interest in engaging on along the lines of Muhammad was talking about reformism. Reform is not possible in the Islamic Republic. You either bring it down or you immigrate. That's basically the only two options you have. And that is the conclusion that the youth in Iran have found. So how does Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guards, and I haven't even gotten to talk about what they're doing in the region, but how can they justify being out there in Syria and various places, Yemen, so on, when they're losing their own flock at home? Right? They're literally losing their own flock at home. This is, again, I don't want to say this is my view. This is a view that you hear clearly come out of Iran, from academics to even members of the policymaking communities in the Islamic Republic, who are asking the tough question, what have we done? After 43 years, and we can claim some successes, and Greg was talking about some of Iran's regional successes, and they have created proxies. But proxies for what end? Those proxies are not creating a single job back in Iran. They're costing Iran dearly. And this is what I think, this debate isn't a new debate, but it's just happening now on a street level. And when you look at the demographics really are the one thing you need to look out for if you're United States policymaking community. Who do you want to invest in? Ali Khamenei, the 83-year-old, who at best might sign a limited nuclear deal, but really he's banking on Russia, he's banking on China for his survival. Or do you start looking for ways to help the Iranian opposition? Again, Middle East Institute as an organization, we're not an advocacy organization. We don't go out there and tell U.S. policymakers what to do. But if you are looking for ways to help the opposition as a long-term mission for the United States, were to invest, you rather want to invest in that youth in Iran that clearly wants to go in a very different direction. And then if there is regime change, it doesn't have to necessarily be through the use of force. It could be done as part of a multi-year, multi-pronged campaign where you really start targeting that anger and work with that anger. Now, I think Christian talked about Iran International, right? We don't really know who supports Iran International. Most likely the Saudis and others are funding it. But Iran International, the only reason why it became the platform it is, and I kid you not when I say it's the voice of the protest movement today. It's really keeping the movement alive. The reason for that is because the regime inside Iran literally took out all the oxygen from the room. There was no space for debate. And we have no space for debate. People have been looking for alternative ways, and the Saudis were smart enough a few years ago to tap into that. I'm sure the United States, Israel, and others are helping along this. But this is not a sinister campaign. Everyone knows what's going on. And it's something that was an own goal. The Islamic Republic of Iran is to be blamed for that. So again, Ambassador Satterfield, on the issue of what the U.S. should do, again, what are the values? Do you care about the fact that this country, 3 times the size of France, with 85 million people, a youth, and every survey shows they're pro-American, do you want to invest in them? Or do you want to sort of say, you know what, let's cut another deal with Ali Khamenei about how many centrifuges he can have. He's never going to like us. He's always going to choose Putin and President Xi above us. But we have no choice because the nuclear program is moving so fast, is expanding as fast as it is. We have no choice. I mean, but perhaps, and I think that might be my final word on this, you can be somewhere between the two. You can have a limited nuclear deal, not give up all the sanctions, give up some sanctions relief in return for a new deal, but then look for ways to keep the pressure on the regime in the hope. And again, this might make me sound a bit naive here, but there needs to be, I think, in U.S. policymaking, a belief that the United States can help people out there who do want to sort of live lives that reflect the values of the people in this country care about. Again, that might sound somewhat naive, but let me stop there and maybe try to be hopeful.
Thank you, Alex. I'll pose a few questions. I'll start, Suzanne, with you and then turn to Mohammed, Christian, and then Alex. It's on exactly the comments just made. What should the U.S. do? There are several areas where the U.S. can act. One is a power projection, sanctions, attempting to mobilize particular punitive measures on a multilateral basis directed at the regime or subsets of the regime. And we've seen some of that affected recently in response to the protests. The second is facilitating the ability of those protesting to communicate with each other and with the outside world, and that's something the U.S. government has long been involved in. That's not a question mark, it's an established thing. But when it comes to the messaging, the public messaging, I think there is a great degree of reserve and caution on the part of the administration, broad-based, as to at what point does a U.S. message provide a straw man against which the regime can posture itself. The image of foreign, particularly U.S. intervention in Iranian affairs to the detriment of the demonstrators. And I'd very much like to hear, Suzanne, first from you, your thoughts on constraints and freedoms in terms of adjusting the U.S. message and what to do about the sanctions tool. Helpful, unhelpful, where should we go?
It's a great question, and I think there are no quick fixes or silver bullets for any outside party. I think the administration has been right to stress that the future of Iran is very much to be determined by the people of Iran. But of course, there are things that the United States and other governments can do that can help the people of Iran have a role in determining their own future. And you've named a couple of them. One is to ensure that Iranians do have access to technology. Another is to kind of gather greater international coordination and support for putting pressure on Iran as a result of its human rights violations. And I think that's where the administration is, and that's all good. But I think the sort of traditional reticence or anxiety that we are going to somehow taint Iranian protesters, which has loomed very large in prior crises, including and especially in 2009 when the Obama administration explicitly sought to avoid making the United States the story. Since that time, everyone involved, including then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and now most recently former President Obama, has disavowed that decision. I'm probably the only person left in Washington who thinks it was the right move at a time when the situation was evolving very, very quickly and very unexpectedly in the days after the 2009 election, as it appeared that there was in fact a political movement that was prepared to challenge the regime from within for the first time in a really direct and public fashion and mobilize its insider game to bring people to the streets in a big way. I think there was a kind of decision point, and the Obama administration erred rightly on the side of avoiding making Washington the story. In this case, this is already a phenomenon happening within Iran, and it has a life of its own. It has a self-sustaining momentum of its own, largely because of the repression of the Islamic Republic, which creates new martyrs and new adherents to the cause of regime change by the Iranian people every day through its own actions. And so I think there's very little that we can do that would somehow taint those who are going out on the streets, that would somehow train the repressive force of the Islamic Republic more directly and more squarely on them than is already the case. And so I don't think there's any value in holding back in terms of our support. I think that this is a critical moment because the United States has both articulated that democracy is a defining part of our great power rivalry, and that the strength of the West is its commitment to democracy. And if we appear to be hypocritical, as we often are in the Middle East, we're going to erode the value of that message at a time where it's not clear that the rest of the world fully appreciates or is with us in some of these great power challenges, especially, of course, the Russian war in Ukraine. So I think that it's important that we uphold our values in this case. I think that it's also the right move practically, because realistically, a regime that's under the kind of pressure that it's under at home, a regime that cannot find a way forward for managing those internal pressures successfully, is not a regime that's going to be able to do a viable nuclear deal with, nor is it a regime that we're going to be able to find other constructive ways to modulate its malign activities in the region. We have to be very clear. This is entirely about the character of the Islamic Republic. And whatever hopes we had in 2015 that somehow goodwill could beget goodwill, and that some kind of an arrangement could lead to modulation of other Iranian policies, have long since been disproven. So we have a moment, just as we did in 2009. In 2009, the Obama administration actually used the outrage around the world after watching protesters die on their television sets. Neda Agha Sultan was the name on everyone's lips at that time. The Obama administration really did rally the world in a way to produce a very powerful UN Security Council resolution that enabled states that had never before sanctioned the Islamic Republic to do so. I think we should use the momentum and use the international outrage today to try to further isolate the Islamic Republic and to try to facilitate what Iranians on the streets are trying to do themselves.
So two takeaways from what you've just said. Clear, more explicit message. There's nothing at stake here that hasn't already been put out. We should be crisper in our expression of support. And would you support further sanctions?
Absolutely. And I go a bit further. I think we've been the language around returning to the deal has been very convenient, that we say it's not on the agenda at this moment, but I think there should be a clearer statement that a deal with a government that is sending drones to prosecute the war in Ukraine and repressing its people on the streets on a daily basis is not a deal we're interested in.
Yeah, I'll make an editorial comment. Although the administration has not said what you just said, read between the lines, both on substance of the negotiation and on the context for closing any deal right now. Ain't gonna happen. But Mohammed, what do you think? How's the messaging? What about sanctions? Are we okay? Should we do more?
I agree with much of what Suzanne said in the sense that publicizing and condemning the use of violence by the regime against its population is absolutely critical, and also naming and shaming individuals who have been involved in the crackdown against the citizens. But beyond that, the use of sanctions, the sweeping sanctions against the the nation, the population, further impoverishing the population. I don't know if this is going to be a helpful move. First of all, sanctions, I feel that they have lost much of their utilities. Just look at the Islamic Republic. They have been under sanctions for 43 years, pretty much since the Iranian Revolution. And if anything, the regime sees itself as being more powerful than ever. It's on the verge of becoming a nuclear threshold state. So I don't know to what extent isolating the regime or sanctions can be helpful. And in fact, my sense is that that the regime is about to they're about to make a decision whether or not they want to weaponize the nuclear program. And this is a political decision that they've been hesitating for a long time. But I think now they feel they're at the point that they should make that move. And I think we have been taking this for granted that Iran has not. I think it was the head of the CIA a couple of weeks ago saying that Iran has not made that political decision to weaponize the program. I just don't know if this is going to be the case in the near future. They could change their calculations. They see themselves as a potential great power in the coming decades. They think that there's a new Cold War, and they will be playing a big role. And for that, they need to be very, very strong militarily. So a militarily strong Iran is on top of the agenda of the Iranian supreme leader and the leadership. And that means to have a very strong ballistic missile and drone arsenal, which they already do. And I think the next step is to establish themselves as a naval power in the region. And the IRGC is already producing a massive amount of small and medium-sized boats with military capability. And the reason is they want to protect the flow of oil and also retaliate against the U.S. actions, confiscating their oil tankers and all of this. So, and the next step, the next natural step is to weaponize the program and become a nuclear state. And I hear a growing call from their own base, and it's actually becoming more and more public, which is quite surprising to me, to go nuclear, to weaponize the program. So my sense is that isolating the regime more and more could expedite that decision-making process.
Thank you, Mohammed. Christian, how's our messaging being appreciated or not in the Gulf?
Well, I think partners in the Gulf are looking at the messaging and asking whether it's consistent and going to be any more than 2 to 4 years. I think all partners are watching very closely for the outcomes of the congressional election next week, and then reading from that what they may begin to project forward until 2024, and thinking about the potential of what comes next, in the sense that, as the previous panel has said, there have been 3 different presidents now, for very different reasons, have had quite different, at least rhetorical approaches to regional affairs. And so from that aspect, the messaging perhaps hasn't been consistent. The Gulf leaders, I think, also have become adept at hearing what they think they want to hear, and perceptions, whether or not they're rooted in reality, I think perceptions have very much been driving a lot of Gulf leadership's responses. And so the perception is very, very strong that the US isn't going to be sticking around, even though, as the previous panel has said, there's been no real drawdown of force. There's been no pulling back from the strategic basing and other facilities the US maintains. But if you talk to, or if one talks to some of the leaderships, they seem convinced, and they seem to think Russia and China are there to stay. The Russian intervention in Syria in 2015 was an example of how to intervene to protect an ally or a partner, compared to the lack of a US response in 2019. So in that sense, the messaging, I think, is seen as maybe inconsistent, but also is now looked at through such a prism of perception that maybe the message doesn't even count as much as what people think they want to hear.
Thanks. Alex, I'll ask you your comment on the message, but I will also start with questions from the audience, one of which I'd like your thoughts on, which is, what is the role, if there is one, for the Persian diaspora?
If I could take that question first, I think there's a very important role for the Persian diaspora. The Iranian community around the world is between 5 and 8 million now. It's not a small community. It's a large community. It's a very resourceful community. It tends to be educated. It tends to have resources, including financial resources. And it tends to be very much ready to get engaged. You know, a lot of these folks left after 79, or they're children of people who left after 79. So it's not that long time ago. And oftentimes, I was on a panel a week ago, and an American-born lady sort of made the point, an Iran watcher, that, you know, diaspora has no role to play in this because they don't live in Iran. People who live in Iran who are being suppressed are the ones who should be leading the way. I said I do not for a second dispute that those folks that are in Iran should play the first role because they are the ones who actually experienced the violence and the regime. But don't forget that the diaspora showed up and became part of the diaspora because they fled the suppression, the repression, right? And therefore they have a right. I mean, it's easy to dismiss the diaspora as people who sort of on a Sunday will come out and march along and they go home to their lives in America. But I think actually the picture is much more complicated than that. I think a good part of the diaspora wants to be involved and can be very helpful, particularly in terms of the, you know, as lobbying policymakers in Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, the diaspora is split. It's not unique to Iranians. If you look at other communities out there, I mean, we can talk about Cubans and East Europeans. I know the cases of East Europeans, even Indians and Pakistanis of today. Their communities are split too. So that's not unusual, but it doesn't mean you can't help. And again, I don't know, Ambassador, how you can, as the United States government or various agencies, help the sort of diverse set of views among the Iranian diaspora community that all happen to sort of share in the hope that the Islamic Republic will be replaced by something much better. How can you help them create that message? Because again, that is an important part of this campaign they're on. They need to credibly not just show the Iranian public in Iran, but also many on the fence inside the Iranian regime that there will be a day after. Nobody wants to see what happened to the Ba'athist Party in Iraq after 2003, right? When people didn't know where to go and they ended up not supporting the removal of Saddam Hussein. If you give people a better idea that the day after, unless you have blood on your hands, there might be an opportunity for you to live in a different Iran going forward. Very quickly, Ambassador, just a few words. In terms of a deal right now, I was on a panel with, not a panel, she interviewed me, Masih Ali-Nejad, the lady who brought the whole issue of mandatory veil to everyone's attention a few years ago. And she asked the question of me, would it not send the wrong signal if the United States signed a deal tomorrow and it ended up allowing Iran to have access billions of dollars of its frozen money? I said, of course it would. Billions of dollars. It's Iranian money. It's not U.S. taxpaying money. It's Iranian money. But nonetheless, the message it sends to the Iranian people and the opposition is that the United States still not really sure if it wants to side with opposition. If Khamenei gives Washington a good enough deal, they'll take him over the Iranian opposition. And I think that's why people think that would be, in terms of timing, you do not want to sign anything with Khamenei and his regime right now. In terms of more sanctions, I think you can have more sanctions, but I agree with Mohammed. You know, Iran is the second most sanctioned country on earth today, about 3,600 sanctions. Russia overtook him since February because of the invasion of Ukraine. So there isn't much you can sanction in terms of the big picture, central bank, the Ministry of Oil, and so on and so forth. But you can do is targeted sanctions at individuals who are involved in suppression or keeping this regime alive. Top generals, top security enforcement officials, because they don't want to go down with Khamenei. Not everybody's 83 and think time is up. So you have to keep that audience. You have to keep that audience in mind. And again, I think people in the diaspora are very much conscious of that. And then last thing I say, again, something Mohammed said, militarization. I don't necessarily agree that they're going to go for a bomb because the consequences could be grave. I do know that they love to expend more money on militarization and all the various branches of the armed forces, but the question is who's going to pay for it? They've done this for all these years, and what did they get? They got the protest movement in the streets who are not able to get a job, to have enough money to start a family and so forth. So again, there's the issue of what they like to do and what they like to get away with. Yeah, let me stop here, but I really do think it's important for us in the United States to also keep in mind that part of the Iranian regime that might be willing to see itself jump off this regime change and go in a different direction if given enough assurances and clear agenda. They're not going to go down with Khamenei if his regime ship sinks.
A question from the audience. Assuming that the protests do lead to an overturning of this regime, what emerges? Who is, the questioner asks, their Ataturk, Nkrumah, Mandela? In the Arabic-speaking world, Mabad. What after? It's bad now, but what replaces this regime? And Suzanne, I'll start with you.
I don't think we know. I mean, I think the most likely scenario is if the regime begins to collapse from within, as of course the monarchy did in its final months, that there would be an effort on the part of the security forces to try to mobilize a replacement and to essentially assert control of the rump state of the Islamic Republic. I think that certainly could succeed, although it's clear that the animosity on the streets is not is very much aimed at the security forces alongside the clerics and the theocratic elements of the state. So I don't know that you would see sort of a rapturous welcome from the Iranian population. But what's been so interesting to watch is that we haven't seen significant defections from within the system itself in terms of even particularly conciliatory remarks, but even from those, those of us who've been following this a long time know that, there's still a number of senior political figures who are associated with the reform movement. There hasn't been an embrace. In fact, there are a number of those who were instrumental in the rise of the reform movement in the late 90s and early 2000s, who've expressed both contempt and skepticism and also some sense of fear about what's happening, what's being led on the streets. So I don't think we see a political movement that could really step in the way that there were very well organized political movements that comprise the broad and diverse revolutionary coalition that came together in the late 70s to oust the Shah. I think that we have to assume that that any future leadership is going to come from either a leadership that might evolve around the protest movement, or at some later date if we do see some kind of significant splintering from within the system itself.
Thank you. Mohammed.
So at this point, there doesn't seem to be any leader coming out of the movement unless this continues for a number of years and emerge and gradually a natural leader, either inside or outside of Iran, could emerge. So one possibility is if, and Suzanne kind of alluded to this, if the protests continue, we may see an overture by the regime towards the more reformist elements within the regime who have been marginalized in the past couple of years. But I just don't know to what extent that could work. First of all, the Islamic Republic has been very monolithic, especially since the last election that brought Raisi to power. And I don't see any sign from the regime that would suggest that it's willing to put an end to this monolithic status that it has. So they worked for 40 years to achieve this status, so I don't think they're willing to bring the reformists back into the electoral process. But more importantly, I don't know if the protesters and a lot of Iranian citizens would be welcoming the return of the reformists because they see them as weak, ineffective, and in fact like a safety valve. So, and that is part of the problem, that at this point there doesn't seem to be anyone emerging from the old guard either. Former President Rouhani has been marginalized. Former President Mohammad Khatami was under house arrest, and not a single newspaper could publish his picture until recently. So there doesn't seem to be any person coming out of the regime either. So, and again, that goes back to what I was saying earlier, that because you don't see any possibility, any alternative for what could replace the regime, that's why a lot of people have been sitting on the fence and not coming out.
Thank you. Alex.
The reform movement leaders, they have no one to blame but themselves. They've had plenty of time to actually come out and do something meaningful instead of playing the game that Khamenei allowed them to play. Khamenei would have elections that he obviously very much micromanages in order to give the rest of the world the impression that there is a Republican component to the Islamic Republic. And there are elections that matter. No Iranian, certainly not the generation that is today in the streets, believes that for a second. And Mohammad Khatami, the guy who's supposed to make a big change, I mean, what's the last thing he's been saying? Pretty much committed to the Islamic Republic as it is, and this idea of gradual change that, as I said, the generation in the streets, Generation Z, is about 7 million, right? I'm not talking about the parents' generation or grandparents' generation. It's not an insignificant number. Are they looking for a particular leader? The one name that you hear the most is the name of the son of the previous Shah. He has many people who do not like him as a leader because they don't want a monarchy again, they want something else. So you have that split within the community, which makes me wonder if maybe the better way forward is some kind of a council that includes few handful. You don't want too many people because once you get the commission going, nothing gets done. So you want a smaller council, but a few enough individuals that strategically will coalesce and bring that unity, if you will, leadership together. Is there any work being done along those lines? Yes, for years and years. Have they made much success? Unfortunately not. But again, I go back to a point. This is an area that Western governments, including the U.S., can help in ways that will not be in contradictory to U.S. policy, to help this opposition find ways to have a better dialogue among themselves, because that's really key for them to be taken seriously by folks in Iran and others who try to figure out where this protest movement is going and whether they should join it or not.
And all of this discussion is very timely because the supreme leader is aged. He's ill. How ill is a matter of debate. Right. If he passes tonight in the midst of these protests, you all are going to have to comment the next day, the next week, and beyond on what it all means. And it sounds as if you're saying it'll take time to determine what it means.
Well, we have, if I may go first, we have one example of a succession in the Islamic Republic happened in summer of 1989. And the guy who ended up getting the job, Ayatollah Khamenei, who's had the job for about 34 years now, was probably not anyone's short list. He got it because he was convenient. Enough factions within the clerical and other branches of the regime could rally behind him for one reason. Nobody really saw him as a threat. So when I'm looking at it, this issue of who's going to take over from Khamenei, should he die tonight, I will probably think who is most likely not to be threatening to enough people in the regime that they might support him. And I think someone like Ibrahim Raisi, who is basically just a pawn. He doesn't stand for anything. He doesn't have any political charisma to speak of. Someone like him might actually be convenient, very much if you need to find someone quickly. Why? Because he will probably get the Revolutionary Guards and a good part of the clergy behind him. But essentially, in terms of how this works, in terms of the Constitution, it's done by the Assembly of Experts. And the Assembly of Experts are individuals who, like the Council of Cardinals in the Vatican, choose this Iranian version of a pope, the supreme leader. But since 1989, every single member of that body has been vetted by Khamenei himself. So you can look at this in two ways. The Assembly of Experts will make a decision, which I think would then very much reflect what Khamenei would have wanted to see. Or on the day, it's about who's got the most political power to push through whoever they want to push through and what kind of compromise they can make with other competing factions within the regime.
Mohammed?
Well, the ongoing protests are in fact a reaction to the last presidential election in Iran and the loss of hope that Sudan mentioned earlier today. And the problem is, in this current environment, if Raisi becomes the next supreme leader, or Khamenei's son becomes the next supreme leader, it would further radicalize the environment. So it would make the people much more angry. So that's why what's happening now is actually making those back-channel negotiations about the next supreme leader much more complicated. So my sense is that whatever the regime does, it will try to do something that would not necessarily appease the population, because that's never in their toolkit to appease the people, but to do something that would not make them even more angry, and basically to make the situation much worse. So there are several possibilities in addition to Ibrahim Raisi or Khamenei's son. There could be one of the more senior clerics in Qom, who are one of them who's more pro-regime, and but the issue is many of these clerics are not politically savvy enough to become the next supreme leader. So that's the downside. Another possibility is to come up with a council of leaders, which could be like a temporary step for a couple of months or possibly years, to make sure that things calm down, and then come up with the next person. But if Khamenei dies now, things will get much worse.
Suzanne.
I don't have much to add. I think the key question is who are the power brokers? Who is the Ahmed Khomeini, the son of Khomeini, who conspired with then Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani to try to ensure the smooth progression of leadership in 1989. I think that Mojtaba is probably in that very same role in this case, and my bets are on Raisi as the most likely successor. But Iranian politics is always a little bit surprising, and we should be prepared for a lot of entrepreneurial politics around the time of Khamenei's death.
And Christian, a slightly different question to wrap this up for you. In 2015, Mohammed bin Zayed and Mohammed bin Salman determined to launch their Yemen campaign to teach Iran a lesson, but also to teach the Shia a lesson. Well, that didn't work out so well on either of those two fronts. How does the Gulf respond should there be a significant change in Iranian leadership?
That's a key difference, I think, between 2015 and 2022. And we saw the missile attacks on Abu Dhabi in January this year, when the UAE tried to move some of their groups they were supporting back into the Houthi front lines. We saw missiles raining down on Abu Dhabi, a message very clear that unlike in 2015 or 2016, now in 2022, if you come back into Yemen in a major way, there will be a price to pay. And I think the UAE leadership, just as the Saudis have realized, have taken that to heart. I think there will be a period of trying to determine what happens next. The Saudis in 1979 initially, I think, welcomed the Islamic nature of the revolution in Iran, the fact that Iran seemed to be going back to Islamic values. Both Crown Prince Fahd and others in the Saudi leadership issued statements actually welcoming it, until, of course, they then realized that there were ramifications for the politicization of their own Shia movements. And so I think this time around there will be a very circumspect response, trying to figure out who are the players, what links do they might have to the power brokers, the military, the security apparatus, rather than maybe rushing in precipitously to back one faction or another.
Thank you, Christian. And a last remark. There were several questions submitted asking about the JCPOA and its failure, collapse, suspension in terms of the Iranian nuclear program. Mohammed expressed a view on likelihood or probability of pursuit of weaponization. I would just note it was the assessment of the U.S. intelligence community, as Bill Burns has recently spoken, prior to the original JCPOA negotiation, that Iran had not pursued weaponization as a deliberate and supreme leader endorsed policy decision since around 2002. There has never been any information to counter that assessment through today, as Bill spoke to. The JCPOA's intent was focused on enrichment and stockpile, so that should there be a decision to pursue weaponization, a decision which has not, we believe, been taken, there would not be the materials or the centrifuge cascades available to produce the highly enriched uranium required. Technology is there. You can't put that horse back in the barn. But the stockpile and the cascades would not be there. The critical factor that all states in the West have relied upon to deal with the issue of weaponization is the belief, which may or may not prove correct or determinative, that the supreme leader and the supreme security figures around him understand that if weaponization were to be pursued, it would be found out. And it would be found out well within the multiple-year breakout period for the actual assembly of a device. And on that assumption, that the leadership knows they couldn't do it covertly, they'd try, but they'd be found in the doing of it, and the outcome of that would be disastrous in terms of Iran's standing globally, even amongst those in Europe and elsewhere who would very much like a reconciliation. It would end that, and perhaps more concerningly, it would precipitate unknown but probably significant physical responses to the sources of locations of that program. So on that hangs a great deal. The assumption, the judgment of this or a new supreme leader, and the pressures for and against. We will all see, but thank you all. Suzanne, thank you for participating from DC. Thank all of you for your comments. Thank the previous panel, and audience, thank you. This has been a great event. We look forward to many more like this in our post-COVID program.